On the morning of the 10th of December 1936, a man who had spent his entire life avoiding attention sat down at a desk in Fort Belvedere and signed his name to a document that made him King of England. His name was not on it, his brother's was. Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication, and 3 witnesses signed below him, and one of those witnesses was the man who would inherit everything Edward was throwing away. His hands were not steady, they rarely were. He had a stammer so severe that as a younger man he had once stood at a microphone in front of 100,000 people and simply could not produce sound. He had been the second son, the spare, the one nobody studied, nobody groomed, nobody expected anything from beyond a quiet life of ribbon cutting and Daval ceremony. And now, because his charming, beloved, golden older brother had decided he would rather have an American divorcee than a kingdom, this anxious man was about to become the figurehead of the largest empire the world had ever known, at the exact moment that empire was sliding toward the most destructive war in human history. He went to see his mother afterward. Queen Mary, a woman not famous for warmth, watched her son come into the room, and the man who was now King of England put his head down and wept. He sobbed, by his own later account, like a child. He told her he had never wanted this. He told her he did not think he could do it. He told her he had never even seen a state paper in his life, that nobody had ever shown him how any of it worked, because nobody had ever imagined he would need to know. That is where most people think the story of George VI begins. The reluctant king, the stammering brother, the shy man who rose to the occasion. You have seen the film, you know the shape of it. The brave little engine who could, the speech therapist with the unconventional methods, the triumphant wartime broadcast, the tears, the swelling music. Here is the part the film leaves out. The title says cold, controlling, and never wrong. People come to a story like this expecting a tyrant. They expect the secret monster behind the sympathetic mask, the private cruelty that the cameras never caught. That is the formula, and it sells, and you have watched 100 videos built on exactly that promise. So let me tell you the truth before we go a single step further, because the truth is stranger and in the end more interesting than any invented villain. The cold, controlling figure in this story was not him. The man who became George VI spent his childhood being controlled. He spent his adolescence being overshadowed. He spent his marriage, by the account of nearly everyone who watched it up close, being managed by a wife who was warmer in public and far harder in private than the nation ever understood. And he spent his reign being handled, steered, and occasionally overruled by a circle of people around him who had decided, long before he ever took the throne, that this nervous second son needed to be steered. So why does the word controlling attach itself to him at all? Because there is a version of him recorded by people who served him that the official story sands down. He had a temper, not the loud theatrical kind, the kind that came up out of nowhere and frightened the people standing nearest to him. The household had a word for these episodes. They called them his gnashes. A gnash could be triggered by almost nothing: a misplaced object, a late arrival, a piece of news he did not want to hear. And the people who lived through one did not forget it. And here is the thing that makes him worth 2.5 hours of your time. Both of those things are true at once. The weeping man who never wanted the crown, and the man whose rages could empty a room, the dutiful king the nation worshipped, and the difficult husband and father the household tiptoed around. He was not a saint, and he was not a monster, and the entire industry of royal storytelling has spent decades trying to flatten him into one or the other because a flat story is easier to sell. We are not going to do that. We are going to sit with the contradictions, because the contradictions are the man. Before we go any deeper, do me one small favor. If you have ever wondered what the people who actually lived inside these palaces saw, the staff, the equerries, the family members who could not say a word in public, then subscribe to the channel right now and turn on the bell. Everything we do is built on the accounts of the people who were in the room, not the polished version, the version they only told later, when it was safe. You will not want to miss what is coming, because by the end of this you are going to understand why the people closest to George VI were so fiercely protective of him, and so quietly exhausted by him at the very same time. Subscribe, stay with me. This one goes places the documentaries do not. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you cannot understand the temper, or the stammer, or the tears in his mother's arms, without understanding the house he grew up in, and the house he grew up in was, by any honest measure, a cold one. He was born on the 14th of December 1895 at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. The date mattered, and not in a good way. It was the anniversary of the death of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's adored husband, a day the old Queen still observed as one of national mourning decades later. To be born on that date, into that family, was to arrive under a small cloud. His grandfather, the future Edward VII, actually wrote to suggest the baby be named Albert, partly to soften the blow of the date to Victoria, and so he was christened Albert Frederick Arthur George, and to his family, for the whole of his life he was Bertie. The family called him Bertie, and the world would not learn the name George VI for another 41 years. His father was Prince George, then Duke of York, who would in time become King George V. And George V is one of the more revealing characters in this entire story, because he is the source of so much of what his son became. George V was a former naval officer. He liked order, he liked punctuality, he liked his stamp collection and his shooting and a household that ran on a clock and did not surprise him. What he did not like, or did not know how to show, was tenderness toward his own children. There is a line that has followed him through history, and we will come back later to how much of it is solid. He is supposed to have said that his own father had been frightened of his grandmother, that he had been frightened of his father, and that he was damned well going to make sure his children were frightened of him. Whether or not he said it in exactly those words, and the source is shakier than the endless repetition suggests, it has stuck because it matches the cold, fear-ruled household everyone who was inside it described. Bertie's mother was Mary of Teck, the future Queen Mary, and she loved her children in her way, but hers was not a way that involved much physical warmth or open affection. She was formal, she was dutiful. She deferred to her husband in all things, including the raising of the children, and so when George V decided the nursery would run on fear, Mary did not stand in the way of it. Both parents were, in the language of the time, undemonstrative. The children were brought to them at appointed hours and taken away again. Affection was rationed. Now layer onto that cold house a set of physical problems that would have made any child miserable. Bertie had a stomach that troubled him constantly. He had knock knees, a condition where the legs angle inward, and the prescribed treatment was a set of splints, rigid braces strapped to his legs to force the bones straight. He was made to wear them for long stretches, including at night, and they hurt. This was a small boy, in physical pain, in a house where comfort was not on offer. And then there was the matter of his hands. Bertie was naturally left-handed. In that era, in that class, left-handedness was treated as a fault to be corrected, and so he was forced to write with his right hand against every instinct his body had. Therapists and psychologists have argued ever since about whether that forced switch had anything to do with what came next, but the timing is hard to ignore. Somewhere around the age of 7 or 8, Bertie began to stammer. He was left-handed and they tied the hand he favored behind him, and somewhere in those same years the words stopped coming out. The stammer was not a mild thing, it was a wall. Certain sounds simply would not come. He would push and push at a word and nothing would emerge, and the harder he tried, the worse it became, and the worse it became, the more terrified he grew of trying at all. Now picture that affliction in that particular family. A father who valued nothing more than self-command, who could reduce a grown courtier to silence with a look, a nursery built on fear. A small, sickly, left-handed boy who could not get his words out, sitting at a dinner table where lateness could make a child faint from fear of the man at its head. There is an account of exactly that, a child arriving late to dinner, catching sight of the father's expression and fainting on the spot. That was the soil Bertie grew in, not a fairy tale. A cold, exacting, frightened household, with an older brother who seemed to glide through all of it untouched. Because that is the other piece of the childhood you have to hold on to. The older brother, Edward, known in the family as David, was everything Bertie was not. He was good-looking in the way the cameras loved. He was charming, easy, quick with people. He was the heir, the golden boy, the one the public would soon adore as the dashing young Prince of Wales. And he was, in those early years, kind enough to his younger brother in the casual way that secure people are kind to insecure ones. But the contrast was always there, and Bertie felt it every day of his life. One brother born to shine in public, one brother who could not finish a sentence. I want you to hold that image, because the entire tragedy and triumph of George VI runs out of it. The whole world would eventually be told a story about two brothers, one who gave up a throne for love and one who picked it up out of duty. That story is not wrong. But it starts here, in a cold house in Norfolk with a frightened boy in leg braces who could not speak, watching his effortless brother and learning very young that he was the lesser one. There was one more child in that nursery I need to tell you about, because what happened to him tells you everything about how this family handled anything that did not fit. The youngest of the 6 children was Prince John. John had epilepsy, in an age when epilepsy was misunderstood and quietly shameful to a family like this one, and the family's solution was to remove him. As his seizures grew more frequent and harder to hide, John was sent away from the household to live at a farm on the Sandringham estate, cared for by a devoted nanny named Charlotte Bill, the woman the children called Lala. He was, in effect, edited out, kept apart, visited rarely. He died in 1919 at the age of 13, having spent his last years largely separated from his own family. A family that hid one son in a cottage was not going to know what to do with another son who could not speak. I tell you about John not to dwell on him, but because of what he reveals. This was a family with a powerful instinct to make the awkward thing disappear, the inconvenient child, the embarrassing condition, the flaw that might be noticed. All of it was to be managed out of sight. Bertie absorbed that lesson in his bones. You did not show weakness. You did not make a scene. You did not become the problem that had to be hidden. And a boy who already could not control his own mouth grew up terrified of being the embarrassment, the one people whispered about, the one who let the family down in front of others. Some of his later rages, the gnashes the household feared, make more sense in that light. Here was a man who had spent his entire childhood swallowing fear and humiliation, holding it in, presenting the composed face the family demanded. That kind of pressure does not vanish, it finds the cracks. It comes out sideways, in sudden fury over a small thing, because the large things were never allowed to be spoken at all. It helps to see Bertie not as a lonely figure but as one child in a row of 6, because his whole sense of himself was formed by where he stood in that row, and the fates of his brothers and sister cast long shadows over everything that came after. There were 6 children born to George V and Queen Mary, and their stories together read almost like a catalogue of the ways a cold, grand upbringing can warp a life. The eldest was Edward, called David in the family, the golden heir, charming and restless and ultimately unable to bear the weight of the thing he was born to, who would throw the crown at Bertie's feet and spend the rest of his life in bitter exile. Second came Bertie himself, the anxious one, the stammerer, the spare. Then Princess Mary, the only daughter, quieter and steadier than her brothers, who married into the Harrodwood family and largely kept clear of scandal. Then Prince Henry, who became Duke of Gloucester, a blunt, unintellectual army man with no taste for the limelight. The brother the establishment passed over without much thought when they were scrambling for alternatives to Bertie. Then Prince George, who became Duke of Kent, the cleverest and most polished of them all, and also the most reckless. And finally little Prince John, the youngest, the epileptic boy, who was hidden away on the Sandringham estate and died at 13. 6 children, and not one of them came through that nursery without a wound of some kind. The brother who matters most to understanding Bertie after Edward is George, the Duke of Kent, because his life shows you exactly what the family was capable of hiding and exactly the kind of trouble the crown could not afford. George was assured, witty, artistic, the most socially gifted of the brothers, and his private life in the 1920s and 30s was a whirl of nightclubs and affairs and worse. He moved through the smart, dangerous set of the era, and at the center of his life for a time was an American woman caught up in the drug culture of the period, through whom George himself developed a serious addiction to hard drugs. The thing was kept quiet, as everything in that family was kept quiet, and remarkably it was the eldest brother Edward, the future abdicating king, who is credited with hauling George back from the edge and helping him break the addiction. That is the same Duke of Kent the establishment briefly floated as a possible king in 1936 instead of Bertie, before remembering that a man with that kind of past in his luggage could never survive the scrutiny a throne brings. The palace has guarded his story so carefully that to this day no official biography of him has been authorized. The family that hid an epileptic boy on a farm also quietly hid a prince's drug addiction, and very nearly made that prince king rather than risk the stammering, scandal-free brother. George the Duke of Kent met a hard end. In August 1942, in the middle of the war, serving in the RAF as his brother Bertie once had, he was killed when his flying boat crashed into a hillside in the far north of Scotland. He was 39. His death, like so much about him, trailed wartime rumors and conspiracy theories that have never fully settled. For Bertie, by then King George VI, it was the loss of the youngest surviving brother, the clever one, the one who had been talked of as a rival for the throne, gone in an instant in the service of the country Bertie was leading. Now hold all of that against the man at the center of it. In a family of charming, reckless, troubled, hidden and tragic children, Bertie was the one who caused no scandal, no drug habit, no string of dangerous affairs, no private life that had to be buried. The boy everyone wrote off as the dull one, the lesser one, the one with no charisma, turned out to be the only one of the brothers solid enough to be handed the crown in a crisis without the whole edifice cracking. That is not nothing. In the brutal accounting of 1936, when the establishment looked at George V's sons and asked which of them could actually be trusted with the throne in a dangerous age, the dull, dutiful, stammering second son was, by process of elimination and then by genuine merit, the answer. His very lack of glamour, the quality that had made him invisible his whole life, was precisely the thing that made him safe. The shadow over the whole family was the father, George V, and we should be careful and honest about him too, because he is the origin of the Cold House, and the popular version of him has hardened into a caricature that the evidence only partly supports. The famous line attributed to him that his father had been frightened of his mother, that he had been frightened of his father, and that he would damned well make sure his children were frightened of him, is repeated everywhere as the key to the whole family's misery. And it may capture something true about the man, but it is worth knowing that there is no solid documentary source for that exact quote, and serious historians caution that George V's parenting was probably not very different from that of most stern, undemonstrative upper-class fathers of his era. He was not a monster, he was a rigid, formal, emotionally constipated man who loved his children in a way he had no idea how to show, who valued duty and punctuality and self-command above warmth, and who frightened his sensitive second son without necessarily meaning to destroy him. The point for understanding Bertie is not whether George V was a villain, it is that the household was cold, the affection was rationed, the discipline was real, and a nervous, stammering, left-handed boy in painful leg splints grew up inside it, certain that he was the disappointing one. Everything Bertie later built, the warm marriage, the close family, the camp for working boys, the desperate determination to do his duty well, can be read as one long answer to that childhood. He spent his whole life trying to be the opposite of the cold he came from, and trying to prove, mostly to a father who was dead by the time it mattered most, that the lesser son was worth something after all. I want to stay in the early years a while longer because the Navy is where you see the first real evidence of who this man actually was underneath the stammer, and it is evidence the cartoon versions never use. The boy who came bottom of his class and could not speak turns out, when you read the record, to have been quietly, stubbornly brave, not loud about it, never loud about anything, but brave in the way that costs the most, the way that gets no applause. Start with how he got there. Bertie's path into the Navy was not really his choice, it was his father's. George V had been a naval officer himself before the deaths in the family pushed him toward the throne, and the sea was the one thing the gruff old king felt unreserved affection for. A naval career was, in his mind, exactly the right shaping for a second son. The discipline and the order and the chain of command, all the things George V worshipped. So in 1909, at the age of 13, Bertie was sent off to the Royal Naval College at Osborne, on the Isle of Wight, to begin as a cadet. He was 13, sickly, stammering, and shipped off to be hardened by an institution that prized everything he lacked. He struggled there, and the record does not hide it. He was shy to the point of misery among the other boys. The Stammer made every exchange a small ordeal, and academically he was, by the brutal measure of the final examinations, near the very bottom. In one final exam he came dead last in his class. Last, the son of the future king ranked below every other boy in the room. You could read that as proof he was simply not clever, and plenty of people at the time did read it exactly that way, which is where the lifelong reputation as the dull-witted brother took root. But look closer and a different picture forms. He kept going, he did not wash out. He moved on from Osborne to the senior college at Dartmouth in 1911, and then into the Royal Navy proper, commissioned as a midshipman aboard HMS Collingwood in September 1913 at 17. And here is the detail that tells you the most about him, and that the official portraits leave out because it is too ordinary to fit a king. Aboard ship, his fellow officers did not call him Your Royal Highness, or Prince Albert, or Sir. They called him Mr. Johnson. It was a deliberate thing, a way of shielding his identity and letting him serve as something close to an ordinary officer, and he embraced it. For 3 years he was Mr. Johnson, one more young officer learning the brutal, cramped, unglamorous life of a warship, and by every account he wanted nothing more than to be treated as exactly that and no more. The boy who had been told his whole life that he was the lesser son finally found a place where being ordinary was the point. Then came the war, and then came the single most remarkable hour of his early life, an hour that his admirers and his detractors alike tend to skate right past. On the 31st of May 1916, the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet collided in the North Sea off the coast of Denmark in the Battle of Jutland, the largest naval battle of the entire First World War, and the largest clash of battleships in history. 14 British and 11 German ships went to the bottom. More than 8,500 men died in the space of a day and a night. And the future King of England was there, in the thick of it, 20 years old, at his action station in a turret, the forwardmost 12-inch gun turret of HMS Collingwood. We are not guessing about this. He wrote his own account of the battle, and it survives in the Royal Archives, and it is worth knowing what it says because it is the unfiltered voice of the man at 20, before any of the kingship, before the legend. He describes going to action stations in the late afternoon, seeing the battle cruisers already engaged ahead. He describes the Collingwood opening fire at 5:37 in the evening on German light cruisers, and how the ship's second salvo struck one of them and set it ablaze. And he describes with a kind of plain wonder the moment it became real to him. He had been sitting on top of the turret during a lull, exposed, to get a better view of the action all around him, when a German ship opened fire on the Collingwood, and a salvo straddled her, shells falling on either side. They returned fire at once. Sit with the image. A young man with a stammer so crippling he could barely order a meal in a restaurant, sitting on top of a gun turret in the largest sea battle ever fought, watching enemy shells bracket his ship, and then climbing down to do his job. He is the only British sovereign since William IV to have seen action in battle, not to have worn a uniform for show, to have been shot at in a real engagement, and to have stood his post. The man the establishment would later call too feeble for the throne had already been straddled by German gunfire and held his nerve. And there is one more detail from Jutland, recorded years later by the commander of his turret, that captures the whole of George VI better than any grand assessment a historian could write. During the battle, in the heat of it, with shells in the water and the great guns hammering, Prince Albert made cocoa. He made cocoa for the commander and the gun crew the way he apparently always did, going about the small human task of looking after the men around him while the world exploded outside the steel. The turret commander remembered it decades afterward. "The king," he said, "made cocoa as usual for me and the gun crew during the battle. To understand where the iron in him came from, you have to go back to the sea, to a single day in 1916 that the gentle Stammer story almost never lingers on, because it does not fit the picture of a frail, frightened man. He had gone into the Navy at 13 because his father decreed it, not because he chose it, and the Navy had not been kind to him. He came near the bottom of his class. His health betrayed him constantly, the chronic stomach trouble flaring into something worse. 3 weeks into the war, he was carried off his ship to a hospital in Aberdeen to have his appendix removed, and the duodenal ulcer that plagued him would force surgery the following year, and eventually drive him out of the service altogether. By the ordinary measures, the naval career was a catalogue of illness and middling results, more evident to anyone keeping score that the second son was not up to much. But aboard ship something happened that the scorekeepers missed. His fellow officers did not call him Your Royal Highness or Sir Johnson, a deliberate disguise that let him serve as close to an ordinary officer as a prince could, and by every account he wanted exactly that and nothing grander. For the first time in his life he was being judged on the same terms as everyone around him, and he did not flinch from the test. The test came on the 31st of May 1916 in the North Sea off Denmark, when the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet collided in the Battle of Jutland, the largest clash of battleships in history. Around 250 ships fought through a day and a night. More than 8,000 men died, and Mr. Johnson, 20 years old, was at his action station in a turret of the battleship Collingwood, working the forward 12-inch guns. He was not there for show. The ship came under fire, salvos falling close enough to bracket her, and he stayed at his post and did his job through it. He was mentioned in dispatches afterward. He remains the last British sovereign to have come under fire in battle, not in a ceremonial uniform but in a real engagement, shells in the water, men dying on the ships around him. There is one detail from that turret remembered decades later by the officer who commanded it that tells you more about George VI than any psychological profile. In the middle of the battle, with the great guns hammering and the sea full of fire, Prince Albert made cocoa. He made it as he apparently always did, for the turret commander and the gun crew, going calmly about the small task of looking after the men beside him while the largest naval battle in history raged outside the steel. The king, the commander, recalled years later, made cocoa as usual for me and the gun crew during the battle. Hold that image against the title because it is the hinge of the whole man. The same fixed, narrow, routine-bound temperament that would later make him a difficult husband and an unforgiving brother is the temperament that let him brew cocoa under enemy fire as if it were any other afternoon. The need for order, the refusal to let panic show, the grip on the small routine when the large situation was terrifying, all of it was already there in the 20-year-old in the turret. In a gun crew at Jutland, that quality reads as courage, and it was courage. In a household 30 years later, the identical quality reads as coldness and control, and it was that too. They were never two different men. The steadiness the nation would worship in the bombed streets of 1940 and the rigidity his family would brace against at the breakfast table came from the same root, planted in a cold nursery and hardened on a warship. He learned very young that the way to survive fear was to clamp down on it, hold the routine, control the one thing in front of you, and never let the fear reach your face. It made him brave, it made him unbending. The crown simply gave that lifelong habit a throne to sit on. That is him. That is the actual man, not the cold controller of the thumbnail and not the plaster saint of the film. A nervous, dutiful, quietly courageous young officer who stood his post under fire and made cocoa for his crew because that was the job in front of him and he did the job in front of him. He would do the same thing in a far larger way 24 years later when the shells were falling on London instead of on the North Sea and the crew he was looking after was an entire nation. The Navy released him, and what he did next is one more piece of the doggedness that almost nobody credits him with. He did not retreat into invalid idleness when his stomach forced him off the warships. He went looking for the war again, in the newest and most dangerous service of all. His health had been a torment all through the conflict. 3 weeks into the war he had been carried off his ship to Aberdeen to have his appendix removed. The duodenal ulcer that plagued him required surgery in November 1917. Each time he recovered and pushed to get back to useful service. So in February 1918, with the sea closed to him, he took up a post as officer in charge of boys at the Royal Naval Air Service training establishment at Cranwell. 2 months later, the Royal Air Force was born, the first independent air force in the world, and Bertie transferred straight into it. By that August, he was officer commanding No. 4 Squadron of the Boys Wing at Cranwell, then on to the cadet schools at St. Leonards-on-Sea and Shorncliffe, learning the trade of the air. The sickly, stammering second son went and joined the most modern and most lethal branch of the armed forces in the world, on the ground floor, the year it was founded. He was not content to stay safe in England while the war was still being fought either. He pressed to get to the continent, and he got his wish. Posted to the staff of General Hugh Trenchard, the founding father of the RAF in France. On the 23rd of October 1918, he flew across the Channel to Ortigny. For the last weeks of the war, he served at the headquarters of the RAF's Independent Air Force at Nancy, in eastern France, close to the front. And when the guns finally fell silent in November, he did not rush straight home. He stayed on the continent as a staff officer, and in one of the small honors of his early life he rode beside King Albert I of Belgium during that monarch's triumphal re-entry into liberated Brussels on the 22nd of November 1918. A nice symmetry that. Prince Albert of Britain at the side of King Albert of the Belgians, at the moment a battered continent began to breathe again. Then he finished the job he had started. On the 31st of July 1919, Prince Albert qualified as a fully certified pilot, the first member of the British royal family ever to earn his wings. The very next day he was promoted to squadron leader. Think about the shape of that achievement against the boy we started with. The child in painful leg splints, the cadet who came dead last in his class, the young man who could not get a sentence out without stammering, had taught himself to fly an aircraft in the dangerous infancy of aviation and qualified as a military pilot. Whatever else he was not a coward and he was not soft. It was only after all of this, the Navy, the appendix, the ulcer, the Air Force, the flying, France, Belgium, that he went up to Cambridge in October 1919 to spend his year at Trinity broadening a mind that the examination halls had always undersold. By the time he became Duke of York in 1920 at 24, he had seen a great sea battle, learned to fly, served at the front, and studied at one of the great universities. He had done more and risked more than his glamorous elder brother ever quite managed, and almost no one noticed, because he could not stand up and tell them about it without the words jamming in his throat. Think about what that pattern means, because it repeats for the rest of his life and it is the key to him. Bottom of his class, and he kept going. Crippling stammer, and he stood up to broadcast anyway. Pulled from the Navy by illness, and he went and learned to fly. Handed a throne he never wanted by a brother who walked away, and he carried it until it killed him. The defining trait of George VI is not weakness and it is not strength in the heroic sense. It is doggedness, the refusal to be the one who quit. A man frightened of almost everything who did the frightening thing anyway, over and over for 56 years, because the alternative, being the failure, the embarrassment, the lesser one, frightened him more than any German shell ever could. He had a gift almost no one associates with him, because the stammer and the shyness crowd it out of the picture. He was a genuinely fine athlete and a tennis player good enough to do something no member of the British royal family has done before or since. In 1926, the Duke of York played at Wimbledon, not as a spectator in the royal box, as a competitor in the men's doubles on the actual grass, partnered with his close friend and mentor Louis Greig. They were knocked out in the first round, beaten by a pair of former champions, and it does not matter in the slightest that they lost. The point is that he was there at all, the future King of England, sweating it out on a public court in a real tournament, the only royal ever to take that particular risk of being beaten in front of a crowd. Louis Greig is worth a sentence of his own, because the pattern repeats throughout Bertie's life, and it is the key to how he survived. Bertie needed an anchor. He needed one steadying older figure at his side to give him confidence. First Greig the equerry and friend and tennis partner, then Lionel Logg the speech therapist, then above all Elizabeth his wife, and finally Churchill in the war. The man could not generate confidence from inside himself. He borrowed it all his life from people he trusted, and his genius, if you can call it that, was in choosing the right people to lean on and in inspiring in them a fierce loyalty that made them want to hold him up. Which brings us properly this time to the woman who would become the greatest anchor of all, and to a courtship that was far less of a fairy tale than the legend pretends. He met Lady Elizabeth Beausoleil properly in the early 1920s. She was the youngest daughter, the 9th of 10 children, of the Earl of Strathmore, from an old Scottish family, and she had grown up at Glamis Castle in a household as warm and noisy and affectionate as Bertie's had been cold and silent. She had something he had never had and could never manufacture, which was social ease, the ability to walk into any room and make it hers without appearing to try. He was drawn to that warmth like a man coming in from the cold, which in a sense is exactly what he was. He proposed in 1921. She turned him down, and her reason, which survives in her own words, is the most revealing thing in the whole courtship, because it had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the cage she could see waiting for her. She was afraid, she said, of never again being free to think and speak and act as she felt she really ought to. She had seen the royal world up close enough to understand what marrying into it would cost a free-spirited young woman, and she was not at all sure she wanted to pay it. That is not the hesitation of a girl playing hard to get. That is a clear-eyed young woman weighing a gilded prison and very nearly walking away from it. A future Queen of England looked at the crown and the cage that came with it, and her first answer and her second was no. Bertie did not give up, and here again you see the doggedness that defined him. He told his family he would marry her or no one. His mother, Queen Mary, was impressed enough by his determination that she travelled to Glamis to see this girl for herself. In February 1922, Elizabeth served as a bridesmaid at the wedding of Bertie's sister, Princess Mary, and the following month Bertie proposed a second time. She refused him again. Most men, certainly most princes, would have taken the hint and moved on to someone who would say yes without all this difficulty. Bertie kept on, and finally, on the 13th of January 1923, on what was effectively his third attempt, Elizabeth Beausoleil agreed to marry him, misgivings and all. They were wed on the 26th of April 1923 at Westminster Abbey. As the bridal procession entered the abbey, she stopped, stepped aside, and laid her bouquet on the tomb of the unknown warrior, in memory of her brother Fergus, who had been killed in the Great War. It was a spontaneous act of private grief in the middle of a great public spectacle, and it touched the watching nation deeply. On her wedding day, the woman who would spend her life as the warm public face of the monarchy showed exactly the instinct that would define her, the gift for the human gesture that lands straight in the heart of a crowd. The marriage steadied Bertie almost at once, and with Elizabeth beside him he began slowly to grow into public life. And in 1926 the couple had their first child, Elizabeth, the future queen, delivered at the London home of her maternal grandparents. The little family that would call itself Us Four was beginning to form. Now comes the episode that, more than anything before the war, proved Bertie could actually do the job. In 1927, King George V sent the Duke and Duchess of York on a long royal tour of Australia and New Zealand, with one daunting centrepiece. Bertie was to open the brand new Parliament House in Canberra, the seat of a young nation's government, and deliver a major speech in public to thousands of people, with the whole empire watching. For a man whose Wembley speech 2 years earlier had been a public humiliation, this was the examination of his life. He had started working with Logue in October 1926, and the Australia tour was the first great test of whether the work had taken. On the long sea voyage out, Bertie practiced. He wrote to Logue from the Caribbean about it in his own words, mentioning his old terror of one particular toast, the toast to the king, which contained sounds that had always tripped him. He told Logue that he now gave that toast every single evening at dinner aboard ship, and that it no longer worried him. Picture it. The future king alone on a ship crossing the world, standing up at dinner night after night to drink the king's health, not because the occasion demanded it, but because he was drilling himself privately, relentlessly against the one phrase he feared most, until the fear wore away. The man practiced his own terror every night at sea until it lost its power over him, and no one watching the polished prince in Canberra would ever have guessed the work behind it. It paid off. On the 9th of May 1927, the Duke of York opened Parliament House in Canberra, and he got through his speech. Observers noted that he spoke resonantly and without stuttering. Logue had not even travelled with him. Bertie had done it on his own, carrying the techniques the Australian had given him, and he had stood up before a new nation and not faltered. 9 years before the crown fell on him, in a hall on the other side of the planet, Bertie quietly proved he could be a king. Almost nobody back home was paying attention. There is one more thing from these years that belongs on the record, because it shows the heart of the man as clearly as anything he ever did. Starting in 1921, the Duke of York founded and ran an annual summer camp that became known simply as the Duke of York's Camp. Every year the camp brought together a few hundred boys, half drawn from the elite private schools, and half from the hard industrial towns and factories, and had them live together for a week as equals and as the Duke's personal guests. They sang songs, played games, shared tents, and crossed a class divide that British society otherwise treated as an unbridgeable law of nature. And Bertie did not simply lend his name to it and stay away. He turned up. The shy, stammering Duke came to the camp himself, joined in the sing-songs, sat with the boys, this awkward prince who could barely manage a public sentence, choosing year after year to spend time among ordinary working lads because he genuinely believed the classes ought to know one another. He kept it up for most of 2 decades, right until the war swallowed everything in 1939. Hold that against the title one more time. Cold, controlling, and never wrong. The real young Bertie founded a camp to break down the class wall, turned up in person to sit among factory boys, drilled himself against his own Stammer alone at sea, lost gamely in the first round at Wimbledon, and courted for 2 years a woman who twice told him no. None of that is cold. None of it is the behavior of a controlling man. It is the record of a shy, determined, fundamentally kind person slowly building himself, piece by piece, into someone who could carry a weight he never asked for and did not yet know was coming. This is where the word controlling starts to attach to the wrong person, because there is a strain in the contemporary accounts recorded by people who knew the couple well that paints Elizabeth not merely as the supportive wife of the romantic legend but as the dominant force in the marriage. One famous diarist of the period, a society figure who moved in exactly these circles and knew the couple over many years, wrote a private assessment of them both that is brutally frank. He described Elizabeth as charming, always charming, kind and gentle, and also as fundamentally lazy and possessed of a sharp tongue she could not always resist, willing to make a spiky little remark about whoever had just left the room. And of Bertie he wrote, with no kindness at all, that the king was good and dull and dutiful and a thorough bore, and that all his mature life he had been entirely under the dominion of his wife. A man who knew them both wrote that the king was, in plain words, completely under his wife's thumb. Now you have to take a private diarist's venom with some salt. He was a snob and a gossip, and he wrote to wound, but he was not making the basic dynamic up, because plenty of other people saw the same thing from gentler angles. The point is not that Elizabeth was a villain. The point is that the popular image has the power flowing the wrong way. The story sells George VI as the controlling one, and Elizabeth as the warm support act. The people in the room often saw the reverse. A man steered by a stronger-willed wife, a man whose backbone in private was frequently hers. So when you hear cold, controlling, and never wrong, ask yourself who in this marriage actually fit that description. The answer is more uncomfortable than the title lets on. A person shows you their character most plainly in the thing they choose to make when no one is forcing their hand. And the thing George VI chose to make, the moment he had the power to make it, was the exact opposite of the cold house he had grown up in. Remember the nursery in Norfolk, a father who governed by fear and said so out loud, rationed affection, painful splints, a hidden brother sent off to a farm. That was the model of family Bertie was handed, and when he started a family of his own, he did not repeat it, he reversed it. The man raised on fear built a home on love, on purpose, because he knew exactly what the other thing felt like. Elizabeth was born in 1926, the elder daughter, the one her father called Lilibet, the future Queen Elizabeth II. Margaret followed in 1930, born at Glamis Castle in Scotland, and for 10 years, because the throne was supposed to belong to Bertie's brother, the four of them lived something close to the quiet family life Bertie had always wanted. They had a London house and, from 1931, a country home, Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. They were a unit, fiercely close, and they had a private name for themselves that tells you everything. They called themselves Us Four, not the royal family, not the Yorks, Us Four. A small, warm island of 4 people, set a little apart from the cold grandeur around them. He adored both girls and saw them clearly, with a father's eye for the difference between his children. Elizabeth was the serious one, well-behaved, conscientious, dutiful almost from the cradle. Margaret was the livelier one, playful, determined, mischievous. And he had a phrase for the two of them that has survived because it is so exactly right. Elizabeth, he said, was his pride. Margaret was his joy. Pride and joy split between 2 daughters, the steady one and the spark. There is a whole theory of a man's heart in those 4 words, and not one of them is cold. This is the same man, remember, the title wants you to believe was cold, controlling, and never wrong. Hold the words pride and joy against that, and feel how badly the title fits the private man. And the love ran the other way too, which is the surest sign it was real. His daughter Elizabeth worshipped him. When he was crowned in 1937, the 11-year-old princess wrote about the day in her own hand, describing how beautiful her papa looked and the haze of wonder she felt in Westminster Abbey watching him become king. That is not a child performing duty. That is a child who loved her father watching him do a frightening thing and being proud of him for it. We know, from those who were near him, that he could scarcely speak of Lilibet without his eyes filling. A cold man does not weep at the thought of his own child. Now, in fairness and in keeping with the honesty this whole telling has tried for, the wife at the center of Us Four had harder edges than the saintly Queen Mother legend admits. She could be steely. She could deliver a quiet, spiky remark about a person the moment they left the room, and then be perfectly charming to their face. She was, by several accounts, fundamentally unhurried in a way that could shade into laziness, and her capacity for a long, cold grudge was formidable. The clearest example is her hatred of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, the brother who abdicated and the woman he married. She blamed them with a fury that never cooled across the decades, for forcing the crown onto her unwilling husband and, as she saw it, for shortening his life with its strain. That grudge lasted, by every account, for the rest of her very long life. She outlived her husband by half a century, dying in 2002 at the age of 101, and the steel in her never rusted. So the marriage that the romantic story paints as the gentle wife supporting the troubled king was, in the living of it, something more complicated and more interesting. She was warm and she was hard. She steadied him and she dominated him. The popular image has the power flowing from the cold, controlling king down to the warm, supportive wife. Turn it the right way up. The warmth in that family flowed largely from a husband and father who had decided, against everything his own childhood taught him, to love his children openly. And the steel, the control, the long memory for a slight lived more in the charming wife than anyone watching the newsreels would ever have guessed. Before I take you into the abdication, the moment everything changed, this is the right place to pause for a second favor, and it costs you nothing. If you are finding that the real story is more tangled and more human than the version you were handed, that is exactly the point of this channel. We do not deal in cartoon villains and plaster saints, we deal in the accounts of the people who were actually there. So if you have not yet, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me one thing about George VI you were taught that you are now starting to doubt. I read them, and it genuinely helps the channel reach more people who are tired of the polished, sanded down version of history. Subscribe, comment, and let us get into the night the whole world changed for this anxious, underestimated man. On the 20th of January, 1936, George V died at Sandringham. The old king, the stern father who had governed his children by fear, was gone, and the golden elder brother David became King Edward VIII. For Bertie, this was the natural order of things finally arriving. His brother was king. His brother would marry suitably in time and produce heirs, and Bertie would slide one more place down the line and back into the comfortable shadows where he had always lived. That was the plan the whole machinery of the monarchy had been built around. It lasted not quite 11 months. The trouble had a name, and the name was Wallis Simpson. Edward had been involved with her for a couple of years already, and as king he made no real effort to hide how serious it had become. The British press, in an act of restraint almost impossible to imagine now, kept a voluntary silence through most of 1936. The American and continental papers were full of it. Photographs of the king on holiday with this married American woman were splashed across newspapers from New York to Paris, but in Britain the story was simply not printed, by a gentleman's understanding among the press barons. So the British public, the people Bertie would soon be asked to lead, knew almost nothing, while abroad the scandal was an open roar. The country was about to lose a king, and most of the country did not yet know it was happening. Behind the curtain, the men who ran the country could see exactly what was coming. In October, Wallis Simpson filed for divorce from her second husband. To the king's private secretary, a careful man named Alec Hardinge, the meaning was unmistakable. If she became free, Edward intended to marry her, and a twice-divorced woman with 2 living former husbands could not be Queen of England, not with the king standing as supreme governor of a church that did not recognize remarriage after divorce. On the 13th of November, Harding wrote the king a blunt warning. The press silence would not hold much longer. When it broke, the reaction could be catastrophic. The king brushed it aside. 3 days later, on the 16th of November, Edward summoned the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, to Buckingham Palace and told him plainly that he intended to marry Wallis. Baldwin told him, just as plainly, that the country would never accept her as queen. The choice of who sat beside the king was not a private matter, Baldwin argued. It was a matter of the whole nation's concern. Edward's reply settled everything that followed. He would marry her, he said, and if the government would not have it, then he was prepared to go. He was prepared to go. Sit with that. From Bertie's position, the king had just told the Prime Minister he would rather surrender the throne than give up this woman, and the throne he was talking about surrendering would land on his nervous, stammering younger brother, who had never been trained for it and had never wanted it. There was, for a few desperate weeks, a search for some way out that did not end in abdication. The main idea floated was a morganatic marriage, an arrangement in which Edward could marry Wallis but she would not become queen and any children would have no claim to the throne. Edward seized on it. But on the 2nd of December, Baldwin told him the morganatic option was impracticable. It had been put hurriedly to the governments of the Dominions, to Australia and Canada and the rest, and they would not wear it any more than the British government would. The escape hatch was sealed. The next day the dam broke. On the 1st of December, a bishop named Alfred Blunt, the Bishop of Bradford, gave a speech that was taken, rightly or wrongly, as a pointed criticism of the king's conduct. The British press finally treated that as permission to break their silence, and by the 3rd of December the story was on every front page in the country. The word abdication appeared in a British newspaper for the first time. The thing the establishment had managed in whispers for months exploded into the open all at once, and the public that had known nothing suddenly knew everything. For 1 week the country tore itself apart over it. Winston Churchill, then out of power in what he later called his wilderness years, saw a cause and urged delay. "Give the king time," Churchill argued. "Time and patience, do not rush him to a decision." But the temper of Parliament and of most of the people ran against Edward, and the delay Churchill wanted never came. Through all of this, Bertie was in agony, and he was also struggling simply to find out what was going on. He was the heir to everything that was about to happen, and he could barely get a meeting with his own brother. He tried repeatedly to see Edward in those final weeks and was put off, kept at arm's length, while the decision that would reshape his entire life was made in rooms he was not in. And there was that other, colder current running underneath. With confidence in Bertie so low in some quarters of the establishment, there had been quiet talk of passing him over. The name that came up as an alternative was the fourth brother, George, Duke of Kent, who was clever and polished and crucially already had a son to follow him. The idea did not last. The Duke of Kent's private life would not have survived the scrutiny a king receives, and Baldwin put a stop to the notion. But imagine being Bertie and knowing, as he surely did, that men at the very top had sat in rooms and wondered aloud whether there was anyone at all, they could put on the throne instead of you. On the 9th of December, Edward made his decision final and told Baldwin he would abdicate. The legal machinery now had to move with care, because the British monarchy was not only British, it was the shared crown of a collection of dominions, each with its own parliament, and the abdication had to be enacted across all of them. For a strange window of roughly 24 hours, owing to the way the Irish Free State handled its own legislation, Edward technically remained king in Ireland, while his brother had already become king in Britain and the other dominions. On the 10th of December 1936, at Fort Belvedere, Edward's house, it was done. Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication. He declared his irrevocable determination to renounce the throne for himself and for his descendants, and he did not sign it alone. 3 witnesses signed below him, his 3 younger brothers, and the first of them was Prince Albert, Duke of York. Bertie, the man who was, the instant the ink dried, King of the United Kingdom. He stood in his brother's house and watched his brother sign away the throne, and then he picked up the pen and signed his own name as a witness to his own transformation. The next day, the 11th of December, Parliament passed His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act, and Edward VIII's reign was formally over. That evening, Edward went on the radio and gave the speech the world remembers, the one where he said he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved. It is a beautiful piece of broadcasting. It is also, from Bertie's side of the family, the sound of a man explaining why he was handing his terrified brother a job that might destroy him. On the 12th of December, the Duke of York was formally proclaimed King George VI. He chose his regnal name with deliberate care. He could have reigned as King Albert. Instead, he chose George, to reign as George VI, a direct and pointed gesture toward his father, George V, a signal of continuity and stability after the chaos his brother had unleashed. The message was clear: the reckless interlude is over. We are returning to the steady, dutiful line. And the bitterness did not end with the signing. Edward, now styled Duke of Windsor, married Wallis in France the following June in 1937, and George VI issued letters patent that granted Edward the style of Royal Highness but pointedly denied it to Wallis. She would not be Her Royal Highness. It was a calculated slight, and it enraged Edward for the rest of his life, and it was very much in keeping with the harder edges of the household around the new king. The same circle, the same wife, who could deliver a spiky remark without raising her voice. The relationship between the two men, the one who left and the one who stayed, was reduced over the years to money and grievance and cold correspondence. If you want the single clearest piece of evidence for the cold, controlling, never wrong man behind the wartime saint, it is not a rage or a slammed door. It is a document. It is the way he handled his brother's wife, and it was done not in anger but in cold ink, with lawyers, against the advice of people who told him it was wrong. When Edward abdicated, he remained, automatically and by his own father's 1917 letters patent, a prince with the style of Royal Highness. By every ordinary rule of the monarchy and of British common law, his wife took her husband's rank. Wallace, on marrying him, should simply have become Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Windsor. There was no need to do anything. The status was hers by the plain operation of the rules. George chose to intervene, and the way he did it is the tell. He had fresh letters patent drawn up, dated the 27th of May 1937, that re-granted the Duke of Windsor the style of Royal Highness while specifically excluding his wife and any children they might have. The legal reasoning was thin to the point of contradiction. The new grant pretended Edward had lost a rank he had never actually lost, in order to claim the power to withhold it from Wallace, and constitutional lawyers have called it one of the most flagrant acts of discrimination in the history of the dynasty. To push it through, George was obliged under the Statute of Westminster to consult the Dominions and to act on his minister's advice. He did not want advice that might come back the wrong way, so he wrote to the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, and told him exactly what he wished the advice to be, and the matter was ratified, to the conclusion George had already decided on in Baldwin's last cabinet meeting before he left office. Read that sequence again because it is the whole title in miniature. He reached past the normal rules to engineer a specific humiliation. He chose the lawyer's reasoning to fit the result he wanted rather than letting the result follow the reasoning. And he arranged the advice in advance so that the only counsel he received was the counsel confirming what he had already determined. Cold in that he did it by document rather than by quarrel. Controlling in that he bent the constitutional machinery to his purpose. Never wrong in the most literal sense, he built the process so that no one was positioned to tell him he was wrong. The brother, when the letter reached him a few days before the wedding, read it and said, with bitter accuracy, that it was a nice wedding present. The denial was not the end of it. George forbade the members of the royal family to attend the wedding at all. Edward had specifically wanted his brothers, the Dukes of Gloucester and Kent, and his cousin Louis Mountbatten to stand with him. None of them came because the king would not permit it. The Church of England refused to sanction the marriage, so it was performed at a borrowed chateau in France by a single County Durham clergyman acting against his own bishop's wishes. The most famous bridegroom in the world, married in a rented house, attended by almost no one of his blood, because the brother who had been handed his throne had decided the freeze would be total, and it stayed total, for the rest of both their lives. The denial of those three letters, H, R, and H, followed the couple to the grave literally. When the Duke of Windsor was buried, his stone recorded his full royal style, His Royal Highness the Prince Edward. When Wallace was buried beside him, her stone read simply Wallace, Duchess of Windsor. Even in death, the distinction George had manufactured in 1937 held. The making of Edward a royal duke had another quiet edge to it too, a controlling one. By creating him a duke, George ensured his brother could neither stand for the House of Commons nor speak on politics in the Lords. The grant of a grand title was also the closing of every door through which the former king might have found a public voice again. It looked like generosity. It functioned as containment. You can defend the broad policy. Edward was a genuine liability. His flirtation with the German regime made the distance prudent, and a monarchy in a dangerous decade could not afford a loose former king with a grievance. The institutional case is real and it should be granted. But the institutional case explains the distance. It does not explain the manufactured legal humiliation of a woman, the rigged advice, the forbidding of brothers to attend a wedding, the refusal that was maintained for 35 years past the point of any danger. That part was not policy. That part was the man. A warmer person, less frightened, less certain of his own rightness, could have kept his brother at arm's length without reaching into the law to deny a sister-in-law her name. George reached, and then he never let go. Now we arrive at the thing he is most famous for, and the thing that, more than anything else, turned him from a figure of pity into a figure of genuine respect. The voice. A king in 1936 could not hide the way a king in 1836 could. There was radio now, there was the newsreel. The sovereign was expected to speak directly into a microphone to millions of people at once, and to do it without faltering. On the 31st of October 1925, Bertie, then 29 and Duke of York, stood up to give the closing speech at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley. A crowd of 100,000 people stood in the stadium in front of him, and what had always been a private torment became a public one in the worst way imaginable. The words would not come. He pushed at them and stalled and left long, agonizing silences hanging in the open air while 100,000 people, and the listening empire beyond them, waited and winced. 100,000 people stood in a stadium and listened to the future king fail to speak, and the silence went on and on. But there was one man in the listening audience that day who heard something other than failure. Lionel Logue, an Australian speech therapist newly arrived in London, listened to the Duke's struggle and made a cool, professional judgment that would change both their lives. "He's too old," Logue is supposed to have remarked, "for me to manage a complete cure, but I could very nearly do it." Not a cure, a management. Logue, unlike the optimists and quacks who had failed Bertie before, was honest from the very first about what was and was not possible, and that honesty turned out to be the foundation everything else was built on. Lionel Logue was born in Adelaide, South Australia, in 1880. He had no medical degree. He was by training an elocution teacher and an amateur stage actor, a man who understood the human voice from the inside, as a performer rather than from the outside as a physician, and he had done something during and after the First World War that gave him a deeper understanding than any textbook could. He had worked with soldiers coming home shell-shocked, men whose speech had been shattered by trauma, and in working with them he had learnt the thing the medical establishment kept missing. The voice was not only a mechanical instrument, it was tangled up with fear, with confidence, with the whole hidden weather of a man's mind. Bertie did not go to him willingly at first. He had been through a parade of experts already, and their methods had been useless or worse. He had been told in all seriousness that the cure for his stammer was to fill his mouth with marbles and speak around them. He had been told that smoking would relax his throat and help his speech, advice that did real harm to a man who would eventually die in part from his cigarettes. It was his wife Elizabeth, pressing as she always did, who got him through the door. What Logue did differently was treat him as an equal in the room. He insisted on first names. He stripped away the deference, the bowing, the whole apparatus of rank that had surrounded Bertie since the cradle, and dealt with him plainly, as one man helping another man with a problem they would solve together through hard work. For a person who had spent his entire life as the lesser son, being treated as a plain equal by this irreverent outsider was in itself part of the medicine. The work itself was physical and relentless. Logue understood that a great deal of stammering is a failure of breath and rhythm, and so he drilled Bertie in breathing, in controlling the diaphragm, in the muscular mechanics of producing sound under control, standing at an open window and intoning vowels aloud, tongue twisters, repeated until the troublesome sounds lost their power to trip him, and underneath all the physical drilling, Logue did the thing no one else had dared. He got Bertie to talk about the fear itself. The drilling was not a single triumphant breakthrough. It was a discipline he carried for the rest of his life. That is the truth the inspiring movie ending obscures, and it makes the man more impressive rather than less. George VI was never cured. He learned to manage. For the great broadcasts, the ones that mattered, he prepared with Logue beforehand and often had Logue physically present in the room, and the texts of his speeches were even marked up to help him, words respaced and pauses planted to keep him ahead of the sounds that would block him. The slow, deliberate, weighted delivery that the nation came to hear as dignity and calm and gravity was, in part, a technique, a controlled pace that let him stay one step in front of his own affliction. But it was work. Every single time, for the rest of his life, it was work, and the fear never fully left him, and he did it anyway. That is the whole man in a single habit. There is a deeper layer to the speech work that the film never had room for, and it bears directly on the title, because the man who emerged from those sessions was not softened, he was equipped. The control survived the cure. For most of the 20th century, the full story sat in a box in an attic. Lionel Logue's grandson, Mark Logue, inherited it after his own father died, and only when the film was being made did he open it properly and find what was inside: his grandfather's diary. The appointment cards, on which Logue had neatly recorded every session, sometimes with private notes about the king's health and mood, and a trove of nearly 100 letters between the two men, spanning a quarter of a century. The letters track the relationship with a precision no biographer could have invented. In the early years, George signs himself Albert, his name before the crown. After 1936, the signature changes to George. And throughout, even as the warmth between them deepens into genuine friendship, Logue never once drops the deference. He addresses the most powerful man in the empire as Your Royal Highness, then as Your Majesty, while the king writes back to Dear Logue. The friendship was real, so was the unbridgeable line of rank, and George never let it dissolve, not even with the one man who had handed him his voice. What the papers reveal about the method matters for understanding the will underneath. The work was not a charming montage. It was years of daily discipline, breath and rhythm and rehearsal, and the king submitted to it with the same grinding doggedness he brought to everything that frightened him. 5 days after his coronation in 1937, he wrote to Logue to thank him, confessing how badly the rehearsal had gone, how anxious he had been, and admitting plainly that he could not have got through the ceremony without Logue's supervision. He enclosed the letter in a silver cigarette case engraved to My Dear Logue. It is a touching gesture, and it is also revealing in a darker way, because the gift was a cigarette case, and the cigarettes were the thing that would kill him. The instrument of his death, handed as a token of gratitude for the mastering of his voice. Here is the part that connects straight to the cold, controlling man of the title. The therapy gave him command of his speech. It did not give him ease or flexibility or mercy. The same years in which Logo taught him to breathe through a sentence were the years in which he froze his brother out, denied his sister-in-law her dignity, and built the household his staff would learn to tiptoe around. Logo worked on the throat. The will behind it stayed exactly as it was. When the king stepped up to the microphone for the declaration of war in 1939, reading from the marked-up script that survives in Logo's archive to this day, the voice was steadier, but the man speaking through it was the same exacting, anxious, unbending figure he had always been. The cure was real. The character it served was unchanged. That is the thing the inspiring version leaves out. Mastering the voice did not mellow the man, it armed him. Logue stayed close to the end. He was there for the great broadcasts through the war, invited to the family's Christmas to help with the message, decorated by the king he served. And when George died in 1952, the widowed queen wrote Logue a handwritten note of thanks in her own hand, hoping the ailing therapist would soon be better. Logue outlived the king he had carried by barely 14 months. The two men had spent 25 years in a room together, and across all of it, the one who held the power never once forgot, or let the other forget, which of them was the king. It helps to picture him at a desk rather than at the famous microphone. Papers stacked, cigarette smoke, a private secretary waiting, a sentence marked, a minister's standing weighed, a daughter's plan delayed, a brother's wife kept outside the warm circle. Control held a pencil in private long before it wore a crown in public. The phrase "never wrong" describes a posture more than any quotation. His sacrifices had made him certain. He had taken the crown after Edward walked away, mastered enough speech to face the microphone, and stayed in Britain under bombing, and after all that, other people's private complaints could look small to him. He had suffered for duty, so he expected the same of everyone around him. There is a chapter that belongs in the months just before the war, and it is one of the most underrated things George VI ever did, because it was the first time the dutiful, anxious man was sent out to do real work on the world stage, and he came back having quietly done something that mattered. In the spring of 1939, with the shadow of another European war lengthening by the week, the King and Queen crossed the Atlantic to tour Canada, and then to make a 4-day visit to the United States. No reigning British monarch had ever set foot in either country before. The voyage out was itself a small ordeal, the crossing taking far longer than planned because the liner had to pick its way through ice in the North Atlantic, and they finally came ashore at Quebec in the middle of May. What followed was, by every measure, the most successful royal tour in Canadian history. The couple crossed the whole breadth of the country by train, and the crowds that turned out at every stop were enormous, and the careful management of the trip made a point of it. The Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King attending the King throughout so that the message landed clearly. George was not visiting Canada as a foreign sovereign. He was there as King of Canada in his own right, and a young dominion that might have drifted felt itself bound a little tighter to the crown. The deeper purpose lay south of the border. The United States in 1939 was deeply isolationist, in no mood to be dragged toward another European war, and President Franklin Roosevelt understood far better than most Americans that the war was coming and that Britain would need American sympathy to survive it. So Roosevelt had pressed for the visit, and he set out, with great deliberation, to charm the shy British king, and to be charmed by him. They talked late into the night at the president's estate at Hyde Park, on the Hudson, two heads of state speaking frankly about the danger gathering in Europe and the defense of the democracies, while the formal machinery of diplomacy was set aside. And then there was the picnic, the small, deliberate piece of theater that did more diplomatic work than any treaty. On a warm Sunday in June, Roosevelt had the royal couple to an informal lunch at Hyde Park, and on the menu, written down in plain words, were hot dogs. The Queen, by the story that has come down, leaned over and asked her host how on earth one was meant to eat the thing. The King ate his, reportedly went back for another, and the image of the King of England eating an American sausage in a bun at a president's picnic ran in every newspaper in the United States. It looked like nothing, it was everything. A stiff, formal monarchy had let itself be ordinary in front of the American public, and the American public warmed to it, and the warmth was real enough that Roosevelt remembered the man he had met when the bombs began to fall and Britain stood alone and desperate for American help. For a man who found public life an ordeal, who fought his own voice for every sentence, the whole tour was an act of sustained effort that the easy charm of his lost brother would have made look effortless and meaningless. Bertie did the hard version, the version that cost him, and it worked. Months later, when he stood at the microphone to tell his people they were at war, the relationship he had built across that ocean was one of the few cards Britain held, and he had been the one to play it. Then came the 3rd of September 1939. Britain declared war on Germany, and the king was expected to speak to his people and to the empire at the moment of greatest dread. This was the broadcast that everything had been building toward, the one the whole story of the Stammer and the therapist had been pointing at. A nation walking into a war it remembered all too well from 20 years before, frightened, and waiting to hear the steadiness or the panic in its king's voice. He spoke, slowly, carefully, with those deliberate pauses, and he got through it. For the second time in the lives of most of us, he began, "We are at war." He told them that over and over they had tried to find a peaceful way out, and that it had been in vain. And the country listened to a man it had once written off as the dull, stammering brother find, in the worst hour, exactly the voice it needed, not a soaring orator's voice, something better for the moment. The voice of a man who was plainly afraid and plainly doing his duty anyway, which was precisely what he was asking of every family listening. The man they had called dull-witted became, in the space of one broadcast, the sound of the nation's nerve. And then came Christmas of that same first wartime year, and the broadcast that bound his name to a few lines of verse forever. On Christmas Day 1939, with the country at war and the future black with uncertainty, he broadcast from Sandringham. Near the end of the address, he told his listeners he wanted to leave them with a message of encouragement, and he read a few lines from a poem by a then obscure writer named Minnie Louise Haskins, lines about standing at the gate of an unknown year and asking for a light to step safely into the dark, and being answered that one should put one's hand into the hand of God. The poem may well have reached him through the women in his family, a favorite of his wife Elizabeth, and the story long told is that it was his 13-year-old daughter, the future Elizabeth II, who handed the lines to her father. Those words mattered so much and became so completely his that decades later, when a memorial chapel was built for him at Windsor, they were inscribed there. What followed over the next 6 years is the foundation of everything good that history remembers about George VI, and unlike the invented scandals of the cheaper retellings, it is all true. When the Blitz came in the autumn of 1940 and German bombs fell on London night after night, there were plans to evacuate the royal family to safety, even abroad, even to Canada. They refused. Elizabeth gave the answer that became famous. The children would not leave without her, she would not leave the king, and the king would not leave come what may. The two daughters were sent to the relative safety of Windsor, but the king and queen stayed, and then Buckingham Palace itself was bombed, more than once. On the 13th of September 1940, German aircraft came in low and dropped bombs directly on the palace grounds while the king and queen were inside. Elizabeth wrote to her mother-in-law Queen Mary about it, and the letter survives. They heard the unmistakable sound of a German plane, she wrote, and before anything else could be said there was the scream of a bomb and a tremendous crash in the quadrangle. The chapel was destroyed. There is a darker theory that hangs over that particular raid, and it touches the brother who started all of this. Some historians have argued, on the basis of his later conduct and his contacts, that the exiled Duke of Windsor, the former Edward VIII, who had toured Germany and met Hitler and was widely suspected of sympathies he should not have had, may have passed information that helped the Germans. It cannot be proven, and honest historians treat it as a serious suspicion rather than an established fact, so I will leave it exactly there. A suspicion, a shadow, but the mere fact that it is taken seriously tells you how poisonous the relationship between the two brothers had become. What matters is what the king did with the danger. He and the queen could have stayed safely behind the walls. Instead, they went out again and again into the bombed streets of the East End, into the wreckage, into the factories and the shelters, to be seen among the people who were suffering most. When the palace was hit, Elizabeth said she was almost glad of it, because now she could look the East End in the face. The king instituted the George Cross and the George Medal, new honors for acts of civilian bravery, for the ordinary people whose courage the old military medals did not cover. 10 days after the D-Day landings in 1944, he crossed to Normandy to visit the troops. Through all of it, he kept speaking, kept broadcasting, kept being the steady voice in the dark. This is the genuine greatness of George VI, and it needs no invention to make it land. A man who never wanted the job, who had been told he was not up to it, who had to fight his own body for every public sentence, stood at the center of his country's worst trial and did not break. There is a relationship at the heart of the war years that deserves far more attention than it usually gets. He was not only a voice on the radio during the war, he was, quietly, behind closed doors, a working head of state, and the man he worked with most closely was Winston Churchill. And it did not begin well, because on the most important question of his early reign, the king backed the wrong man, and then had the grace and the sense to come round. Rewind to May 1940. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister whose policy of appeasement had collapsed into war, fell from power, and George VI's personal preference for a successor was not Churchill. It was Lord Halifax, a steadier, more conventional figure, a man the king found far easier to deal with. Churchill, by contrast, had a complicated past, a reputation for recklessness, and 10 years in the political wilderness behind him. Worse, from the royal family's point of view, Churchill had been a loud public supporter of the king's brother Edward during the Abdication crisis. The king and queen had not forgotten it, so the man who would become the greatest wartime partner of George VI's life arrived in the job as very nearly the king's last choice. But Halifax could not realistically lead a war from the House of Lords, and so the king invited Churchill to form a government. The early weeks were stiff. The king admitted in his own words that he found Churchill difficult to talk to, and hoped that in time he would get the right technique for dealing with him. What melted it was a standing appointment. Through the war, the two men met for a private lunch every week, on Tuesdays, just the two of them, no aides, no ceremony. In that room the king could be briefed on the true state of the war, and Churchill could speak with a frankness he could afford nowhere else, and each man could lean for an hour on the only other person in the country carrying a comparable weight. By February 1941, the man who had wanted Halifax could write in plain words that he could not have a better prime minister. The turnaround was complete and it was genuine. And then there is the single best story of the whole partnership. In the run-up to D-Day, in May and June of 1944, the king and Churchill between them cooked up a plan. They both wanted badly to be there. They wanted to sail with the invasion fleet aboard one of the great warships bombarding the Normandy coast, to watch the largest seaborne assault in history with their own eyes. The King of England and his Prime Minister, both past 50, both indispensable, seriously planned to sail into the guns off Normandy to watch the invasion together. Cooler heads and a good deal of frantic argument eventually prevailed. The king wrote to Churchill urging him to give up the idea, and in giving up his own claim to go he removed Churchill's justification for going. Neither man sailed on D-Day, but the fact that they wanted to, that it took real effort to talk the two of them out of it, tells you that the steady, dutiful king had not lost the nerve of the young officer who made cocoa under fire at Jutland. Whatever the title says about a man who was never wrong, here is a clear, documented case of him being wrong about the most important decision of his reign, and then being big enough to change his mind. So where does the harder material come from? Where do cold and controlling come from if the public man was this brave and this dutiful? They come from inside the house. We talked about the gnashes. George VI was in his father's exact mold in this one respect, a man of sudden frightening temper. A gnash was a sudden eruption, often over something small, a delay, a mistake, a piece of unwelcome news, and it could be intense enough that experienced courtiers learned to read his moods and steer around them. The staff learned the weather of the man, and they learned which days to stay out of the storm. Where did it come from? You already know because we walked through it. A childhood of swallowed fear in a cold house, a lifetime of holding in humiliation and presenting a composed face. That kind of long-suppressed pressure does not evaporate. It comes out sideways, in the only place the man felt safe enough to lose control, which was at home, among the staff and family who could not answer back. He was by every account a warrior of the first order, highly strung, prone to fret over things large and small. He smoked heavily, the habit that would eventually help kill him. Was he never wrong? The never wrong of the title is the one piece that is simply not true of the private man, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to fit a headline. He could be wrong and stubborn about it, and his temper could make it hard for people to tell him so. That is a real flaw, and it is the kernel of truth inside the controlling label. Not a tyrant, a nervous, rigid, short-tempered man whom it was not always safe to correct, but cold. That word does him an injustice, and the evidence is overwhelming. This was a man who could barely speak about his elder daughter without tears coming to his eyes from sheer love of her. The coldness he is accused of was the surface formality of a shy man raised by formal parents. Underneath it was the opposite of cold. Underneath it was a man almost overwhelmed by feeling, who had simply never been given the tools to let it out gracefully. The man the world called cold wept at the mention of his own daughter's name. The war ended, and the man who had carried it did not get to rest. He won the war and then watched, in the few years left to him, the empire he had been crowned to lead come apart. He was a warrior by nature, a man who took every burden personally and could not put it down. And on top of the strain of the war, there was the cigarette habit that had been with him for most of his life. He had started smoking young, and for 4 decades he had smoked heavily, in an age when the deadly truth about it had not yet been proven. He had, even in the cruelest irony, once been advised that smoking would help relax his throat and ease his stammer. The thing prescribed to help him speak was helping to kill him. The advice that was supposed to free his voice was quietly destroying the body it came from. It is worth slowing down on exactly what came apart in those last years, because the scale of it has no real parallel in the life of any other British monarch, and he had to preside over all of it while his own body failed. George VI had been crowned King Emperor, the bearer of a title invented for Queen Victoria in 1876, Emperor of India, sovereign over the largest imperial holding the world had ever assembled. In August 1947, under the Labour government of Clement Attlee, British India was partitioned and granted independence as the 2 new dominions of India and Pakistan, in a process accompanied by communal violence and mass displacement on a scale that still defies comprehension. The king remained for a time monarch of both new countries, but the imperial title was now an absurdity, and on the 22nd of June 1948 he formally relinquished it. Emperor of India, the grandest style any British sovereign ever held, simply ceased to exist, signed away by royal proclamation. The man who had inherited the title from his father was the last human being ever to bear it. The unraveling did not stop there. Burma left the Commonwealth entirely in January 1948. Ceylon, which we now call Sri Lanka, became independent that same year. In 1949, Ireland declared itself a republic and walked out of the Commonwealth altogether, severing the last formal tie to the crown that the Irish had been loosening deliberately since the very day of George's accession back in 1936. The map he had been born into, the one-coloured imperial red across a quarter of the globe, was being redrawn faster than any single reign could absorb. What replaced the empire was something genuinely new, and George VI's name is on its founding. In April 1949, the prime ministers of the old dominions and the new nations gathered in London with one hard problem to solve. India intended to become a republic, with its own president as head of state, and a republic could not, by the old rules, acknowledge a foreign king. India also wanted to remain inside the family of nations. The solution the leaders reached, written into what became the London Declaration, was to create a new role above and apart from the question of who was whose king. George VI would be recognized as head of the Commonwealth, a symbol of the free association of independent states, whether or not any particular member still counted him as its monarch. When India adopted its republican constitution in January 1950, he ceased to be King of India and became, for that vast country, simply the head of the Commonwealth instead. It was an elegant piece of invention, and it is the direct ancestor of the modern Commonwealth that his daughter would lead for 70 years. The empire that had defined his childhood died on his watch, and the thing that took its place was built in part around him. A lesser-remembered man might have raged against all of it, the conservative king watching the imperial certainties of his youth dismantled by a socialist government he instinctively distrusted. What the record shows instead is a sovereign doing the constitutional thing, working with the ministers the people had elected, signing into law a welfare state and a national health service that cut against every instinct his upbringing had given him, and lending his name to the peaceful transformation of an empire into a voluntary union. There is a quiet largeness in that. The frightened second son, who had spent his whole life submitting his private feeling to a duty larger than himself, applied the same submission to the loss of the empire itself, and held the institution steady through a change that might have shaken a prouder man to pieces. His health began to break down in 1948. It started in his legs. He suffered pains, problems with the circulation, and the doctors diagnosed a serious vascular condition. His arteries hardened far beyond his years. There was real danger of gangrene, real talk that the leg might have to be amputated. In March 1949, he underwent surgery to relieve the blockage. He recovered after a fashion, but he was now a visibly declining man, and more of the work of the monarchy began to shift onto the shoulders of his elder daughter Elizabeth, the heir. Then, in 1951, the worst thing. A shadow appeared on his lung. By September, the doctors had found a malignant growth, and on the 23rd of that month they operated and removed his entire left lung. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the age he lived in. They did not tell him it was cancer. The word was kept from the king himself, from the public, and even from much of the medical profession. The operation was described in the careful, evasive language of the day as the removal of structural abnormalities. The man whose lung had just been cut out for a carcinoma was not permitted to know the name of the thing that was killing him. He recovered slowly from the surgery, and the recovery was, by the surface accounts, going well enough. But the cancer had almost certainly already spread. Which brings us back to where this whole story began. On the 31st of January 1952, George VI went to London Airport to see off Princess Elizabeth and her husband Philip, who were setting out on a Commonwealth tour that would take them through Kenya. He was a sick man, and the people around him had advised him not to go, and he went anyway, bareheaded in the cold wind, because she was his Lilibet, his pride, and he wanted to see her off with his own eyes. The photographs from that day are among the most quietly unbearable in the entire royal record. A hollowed-out, haggard man, far older than his 56 years, standing on the tarmac and waving up at the aircraft carrying his daughter away. Everyone who looks at those pictures now knows what the people on the runway could only fear. He was saying goodbye, and somewhere in him he probably knew it. He went home to Sandringham, the house in Norfolk where he had been born 56 years before. On the 5th of February 1952, he spent the day out shooting, doing the thing he had loved his whole life, out in the cold Norfolk air on the estate that had been the one constant of his existence. By every account it was a good day, an ordinary, contented day. He went up to bed that night, and in the early hours of the 6th of February, in his sleep, a blood clot stopped his valiant, overworked heart. A servant brought his morning tea. The tea was never drunk. The king was dead at 56, in the same house where his life had begun. He died as he had lived, quietly, without fuss, doing his duty until the last ordinary day, and then simply not waking. His daughter was in Kenya when it happened, thousands of miles away, at a remote game-viewing lodge. By the story that has come down to, as she had spent the night watching wildlife from a treetop hide, and she came down from that tree on the morning of the 6th of February, a queen, though it would be some hours before the news reached her, and she knew it. She had gone up a princess and come down a sovereign, and the change had been made by the silent stopping of her father's heart in a bedroom in Norfolk. There is one more small, dreadful symmetry to record. At the very time George VI was dying of lung cancer, his own mother, Queen Mary, the undemonstrative woman from that cold nursery long ago, was also dying of lung cancer herself. She outlived her son. The mother who had held him as he sobbed on the day the crown fell on him lived to bury him. She died the following year in 1953, having seen her granddaughter crowned. The country's grief, when it came, was on a scale that surprised even the people who had loved him, and it is worth describing because the size of the mourning is the clearest measure of what the nation had come to feel for the man it had once written off as the dull brother. The news was held back for hours on the morning of the 6th of February while the family and the government were told, and the new queen was still in Kenya. When the BBC finally broadcast it, the announcement was read out, then repeated every 15 minutes, and then the network did something it had never done before and has rarely done since. It went silent. For 5 hours the BBC broadcast nothing at all, a deliberate national hush, the air itself put into mourning. Across the country, theatres and cinemas closed, sporting fixtures were called off. a people still worn thin by rationing and the long grey aftermath of the war stopped, together, for the king who had been with them through the worst of it. His coffin rested first in the small church at Sandringham, near the house where he had been born and died, and then was carried by train to London to lie in state in Westminster Hall. What happened there told its own story. Over 3 days, some 300,000 people filed past the coffin to pay their respects, and the queue to reach the hall stretched for miles through the cold London streets, people standing for hours in the February chill for a few seconds beside a closed coffin. They were not commanded to come. There was nothing in it for them. They came because the quiet, dutiful man who had refused to leave London when the bombs fell had earned something from them that no amount of glamour could have bought. The funeral was held on the 15th of February 1952 at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The coffin was drawn through London on a naval gun carriage, hauled by sailors in the old tradition, the same navy that had made a frightened cadet into Mr. Johnson at Jutland, now bearing him to his grave. As the courtiers moved through the foggy streets, the crowds lining the route stood in near total silence, and Big Ben tolled 56 times, once for each year of his life. His daughter, 25 years old and queen for 9 days, followed behind. The radio commentary, delivered by Richard Dimbleby, was remembered for years afterward for the weight of feeling it carried. Then the coffin was taken by train to Windsor, drawn once more through streets packed with mourners, and laid to rest in the chapel where so many of his line lay before him. His mother outlived him, which is a particular cruelty for any parent. Queen Mary, the undemonstrative woman from that cold Norfolk nursery 60 years before, the mother who had held him as he wept on the day the crown fell on him, was herself dying of lung cancer as her son was buried, and she lived just long enough to see her granddaughter become queen before she died the following year, in March 1953, 10 weeks before the coronation. The cold house in Norfolk had produced at its end this: a son worked into an early grave by a duty he never wanted, mourned by 300,000 people in a freezing queue, and a mother too ill to do anything but follow him into the ground within the year. He had reigned 15 years and not quite 2 months. He had taken a throne he never wanted, dropped on him by a brother who walked away, at the start of the most dangerous decade of the century, with much of the establishment quietly certain he would fail. He had not failed. He had found a voice he was never meant to have, and steadied a frightened nation through its worst hour. He had chosen and quarreled with and come to love the Prime Minister who led the war. He had built, against the cold pattern of his own childhood, a family bound by genuine love. He had presided with as much grace as the situation allowed over the end of the empire he was crowned to rule, and he had worked himself, with the help of his cigarettes and his worry, into an early grave doing all of it. The biographer Philip Ziegler suggested he be remembered as George the Dutiful, and there is no better word. He pursued his whole life, not what he wanted but what he believed he ought to do, and he did it until it killed him at 56. So let us go back to the title now that you have the whole man in front of you. Cold, controlling, and never wrong. The real George VI nobody admits. Here is what nobody admits, and it is not what the title implies. Nobody admits that the real story is more complicated and more human than either the saint of the films or the secret monster of the thumbnails. He was not cold, though he was raised by cold people and wore their stiffness like a borrowed coat. He was not the controlling one in his own marriage, where by most honest accounts the stronger will was his wife's. And he was certainly not never wrong, because he was a stubborn, anxious, short-tempered man whom it was sometimes dangerous to correct, and that genuine flaw cost the people around him something real. What he was a frightened boy from a frozen nursery who spent his entire life doing the terrifying thing because being thought a coward frightened him more. A second son who was never meant for the throne and was kept unready for it on purpose. A stammerer who became the voice of an empire at war. A man whose private temper could empty a room and whose private love could fill his eyes with tears at the mention of his daughter. All of it at once, not a contradiction to be resolved, a human being to be understood. The industry that turns these lives into content wants you to pick one, the hero or the villain, the saint or the monster. I am asking you to hold both. because both are true, and the man who lived inside both is more worth your time than either cartoon. He was difficult and he was brave. He was steered and he was steadfast. He was the lesser son who became, in the judgment of history, one of the more admirable men ever to wear the crown, precisely because none of it came easily and he did it anyway. That is the George VI the record actually supports, not the one nobody admits. The one almost nobody bothers to look at closely because the closer look is harder work than the headline and worth infinitely more. The deepest mark George left was not a policy or a building, it was a method, and he pressed it into the daughter who would outreign every monarch before her. Show up, say little, let ceremony carry what the voice cannot, never explain too much, never let the institution look hungry for sympathy. Elizabeth II learned all of it at home, watching her father hold himself together under strain, and she had it inside her before she understood what it would cost. That inheritance is the best argument the title has, because the method George handed down was control dressed as dignity, and it worked so well that the country mistook it for character. The reticence that looked like wisdom on a queen began as a frightened man's refusal to be caught out. The unreadable composure that the world came to admire in Elizabeth II was, at its root, her father's lifelong technique for never letting anyone see the fear or the doubt. He had spent his whole life making sure the question of whether he was wrong simply never got asked out loud, and he taught his daughter to do the same, and 70 years of her reign turned the habit into the defining style of the modern monarchy. The control outlived the man by 3/4 of a century. But if you want the one public episode that exposes the never wrong man most plainly, set aside the household and the family and look at the single worst political judgment of his reign, because it shows the same instinct operating on the largest possible stage. In the autumn of 1938, Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich, came back with Hitler's signature on a 3-sentence declaration, and announced peace for our time. He had bought that peace by pressing Czechoslovakia to surrender the Sudetenland to Germany without a shot, and within a year it would be exposed as a catastrophe, a surrender that taught Hitler the democracies would always give away someone else's ground to avoid a fight. We know now, and many knew then, that Munich was a disaster dressed as a triumph. Churchill stood up in the Commons and called it a total defeat. The King did the opposite. George did something a constitutional monarch is not supposed to do. He took a side publicly before Parliament had even debated the agreement. He sent Chamberlain a personal message asking him to come straight to Buckingham Palace so that the King could offer his heartfelt congratulations, and then he brought the Prime Minister out onto the palace balcony to be cheered by the crowd below. That balcony was not a neutral space. It was the most sacred piece of stagecraft the monarchy owned, an honor normally reserved for the royal family alone, and George lent it to a partisan policy at the precise moment when the King's symbolic blessing carried the most weight and the least scrutiny. A monarch is meant to stand above the political fray. George reached down into it and put the crown's prestige behind the man who had just been fooled by Hitler. Why did he do it? For the same reason he did most things. He wanted the trouble to go away. Order was his deepest instinct, peace his fondest hope, and a frightened man who has spent his life clamping down on chaos will reach every time for the figure who promises that the chaos can be contained. He was not alone in the wish. The crowds were real, the relief was real. Most of the country wanted exactly what he wanted, but a king's preference is not a private citizen's. When he stepped onto that balcony, he made his misjudgment royal, and he made it without anyone in a position to tell him he had erred, because the balcony is not a place where anyone argues back. It is the purest expression of the never-wrong machinery there is. The king appears, the crowd cheers, and the question of whether he should be up there at all never gets asked. The redemption of that error is the thing that makes him admirable rather than merely stubborn, and it has to be granted its full weight. 2 years later, the man he had not wanted, Churchill, the man whose judgment he distrusted and whose support for Edward he had not forgiven, turned out to be right about everything George and Chamberlain had been wrong about. And George, slowly, did the hardest thing a certain man can do. He changed his mind. He came to lean on Churchill, to lunch with him every week, to value him above any minister he had ever had. By the day victory came in Europe, the king brought Churchill out onto the same balcony he had once lent to Chamberlain, and this time the country wanted them there together, and this time the judgment behind it was sound. The same balcony, two prime ministers, one disastrous instinct corrected by one painful act of growth. Whatever the title says about a man who was never wrong, here is the proof that he could be wrong about the largest matter of his age, and rarer still that he could admit it and change. The never wrong posture was real. So was the one great exception, and the exception is the better part of him. You cannot finish an honest account of where his coldness came from without returning, at the end, to the woman who made him, because Queen Mary is the missing key to the whole character, and she lived long enough to stamp the same iron on the next generation before she followed her son into the grave. Mary of Teck had begun her own royal life as something close to a parcel. Engaged first to the dissolute elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, she was transferred, after his sudden death, to the steadier younger brother who became George V, the family simply moving her sideways from one prince to the next as the succession required. She learned from that beginning the lesson she would teach her children with total conviction, that personal feeling counted for nothing against the needs of the crown, and that the way to survive inside the institution was to subordinate the self so completely that it stopped asking for anything. She was magnificent and she was glacial. She did not embrace her children. She did not get down on the floor with them. She ran the nursery as an extension of the throne, and when her husband decided it would be governed by fear, she did not soften it, because softening it would have been a private indulgence, and private indulgence was the one thing she had trained herself out of. There was a controlling streak in her that went beyond coldness into something stranger. Among the grand families of England it was an open and slightly anxious joke that Queen Mary could not be allowed near a fine small object, because if she admired a piece in your house, a snuff box, a miniature, a piece of jade, the unspoken understanding was that it would be wise to offer it to her before she found another way to acquire it. Hostesses were said to put their best small treasures out of sight before a royal visit. It was, in plain terms, a habit of taking what she wanted under cover of connoisseurship, conducted by the most dignified woman in the empire, and it worked for the same reason everything in that family worked. No one ever told her no. The whole household, across 3 generations, ran on that single principle, that the senior figure's wish was simply the weather and everyone else carried an umbrella, and George had absorbed it in the nursery before he could speak. She outlived the son she had shaped, and her last act in the story is the coldest detail of all, though it was not cruelty so much as the iron working exactly as designed. As George lay dying of lung cancer, Mary was dying of the same disease herself. She did not break, she held the line. And when he died, she gave the family one final instruction that captures the entire ethos in a single stroke. She decreed that the death of the king must not stop the machinery of the monarchy, that the new young queen, her granddaughter, must be received and the succession must proceed, and that mourning, however deep, could not be allowed to interrupt the institution. Even her own grief was subordinated to the crown. She lived just long enough to see Elizabeth become queen, and died 10 weeks before the coronation, having spent her last strength making sure the show went on. The cold house in Norfolk had been her house first. She built the machine that built the man, and she was still running it, from her own deathbed, after he was gone. That is the final turn of the title. Cold, controlling, never wrong. Those words describe George VI, but they did not begin with him, and they did not end with him. They were the operating system of a family that had taught itself, generation after generation, that the survival of the crown justified any coldness, that control was indistinguishable from duty, and that the senior figure was never to be contradicted, because contradiction was a kind of disloyalty to the institution itself. George inherited the system from his mother and his father, ran it through the most dangerous reign of the century, and pressed it into the daughter who would run it for 70 years more. He was its product and its servant, and for 15 hard years its embodiment. The man was warmer than the title suggests, and the machine was colder than any single person in it. Both things are true, and the space between them is exactly where the real George VI lived, the frightened, dutiful, unbending man who did great things and hard things with the same set of hands, and never quite learned the difference because the family that raised him had made sure he never had to. That inheritance helped her survive 70 years on the throne. It also made her slow to change the family's rules when those rules began to hurt the people inside them. Her father's control became her restraint, and restraint became the public language of the whole House of Windsor. You can draw a line from a frightened boy in a cold nursery to the unreadable composure of a queen on a balcony, and the line runs straight through George. Margaret inherited the other half of him, the warmth he gave in private and the walls he believed public duty required. A father can make a daughter feel adored and still leave her, after his death, with rules that cut her adult life in two. When she wanted to marry Peter Townsend, a divorced man, it was George's moral line, hardened by the abdication, that the family reached for, even though George was already in his grave. That is one measure of how completely he ruled. A rule still worked years after the man who set it had stopped breathing. The Duke of Windsor stayed alive across the Channel as the living counterexample, the proof of what private desire had nearly done to the crown. The distance between the brothers never closed, not in the war, not in the long exile, not at the end. George had built part of his own reign around refusing Edward's example, and the family kept refusing it long after both men were gone. If you have stayed with me to the end of this, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel is for. Someone who would rather have the true, tangled human version than the easy lie. So do the things that help. Subscribe if you have not. Like this video so the people who run the numbers show it to more people who are sick of the sanded down version. And tell me in the comments which royal life you want taken apart honestly next, because there are a great many of them, and almost every one has been flattened into a cartoon by people who never bothered to read the accounts of the men and women who were actually in the room. I read every suggestion. I build the next one out of them. Thank you for giving this difficult, dutiful, deeply human king a real hearing. He would not have asked for it. He never asked for anything, which is exactly why he deserves it. There is one more member of that family whose story proves the machine better than any other, because it shows the cold, controlling instinct doing the thing it did best, making an inconvenient truth disappear, and the man it disappeared was George's own younger brother. Prince George, the Duke of Kent, was the fourth son, born in 1902, and on the surface he was everything the title-bearing brother was not: handsome, witty, artistic, socially effortless, the most charming of all of George V's sons. Underneath the polish was a life the family spent enormous energy concealing. In the 1920s, he fell into the orbit of an American socialite named Kiki Preston, known in that fast, dangerous set as the girl with the silver syringe, and through her he became addicted to cocaine and morphine. He carried on reckless affairs with both women and men, in an era when the second was a criminal offense. His rumored liaisons reportedly including the playwright Noel Coward. There were whispers of an illegitimate child. The press, by the same gentleman's silence that had hidden Edward's affair, printed none of it, and the family did what the family always did. It contained the scandal, married him off respectably to the glamorous Princess Marina of Greece in 1934, and let the public see only the dashing prince and his beautiful wife. The detail that matters for the title is who cleaned it up. It was the eldest brother, Edward, the future abdicating king, who is credited with personally hauling George off the drugs, taking charge of his withdrawal, getting him clean. The family closed ranks around the addiction so completely that, to this day, no official biography of the Duke of Kent has ever been authorized. Think about what that means. The same household that ran on control, that subordinated every private feeling to the dignity of the crown, simply edited a prince's addiction and his affairs out of the record and kept them out for the better part of a century. This was the cold machine working exactly as designed, not through cruelty but through erasure. The inconvenient thing was not punished, it was made not to exist, and here is the bitter twist that ties it to George directly. In the panic of 1936, when the establishment looked at George V's surviving sons and wondered whether anyone could be put on the throne instead of the stammering, frightened Bertie, the Duke of Kent's name came up because he was clever and assured and already had a son to follow him. The idea died the moment anyone considered what scrutiny would do to a man with that buried history. The very secrets the family had worked so hard to hide were the thing that disqualified him. So the crown went, by elimination and then by merit, to the brother with no scandal to hide, the dull, dutiful, scandal-free second son. George's lifelong invisibility, the quality that had made him the lesser one, turned out to be the only qualification that mattered. The Duke of Kent died in the war, and his death is the final proof of how the machine handled its own. In August 1942, he was serving as an Air Commodore in the Royal Air Force, flying north on a morale mission to Iceland, when his Sunderland flying boat crashed into a hillside at Dunbeath in the far north of Scotland in poor weather. 14 of the 15 men aboard were killed, the Duke among them at 39. He was the first member of the British royal family to die on active military service in centuries. The official inquiry put it down to a navigational error, controlled flight into high ground, and the documentation around the crash was so thin and so quickly closed that rumors of cover-up and secret missions have never fully settled, fed by the fact that the records were not released. For George VI, it was the loss of the youngest surviving brother, the clever one, the one who had once been floated as a rival for his own throne, gone in an instant. And the family did with the death what it had done with the life. It mourned briefly, sealed the record, and moved on. The machine that hid the addiction closed just as smoothly over the crash. If the coronation was a stage he inherited from his brother, the wireless was the one he had to build for himself, and it is where the whole contradiction of him, the cold control and the dogged courage, finally fused into something the country could love. The Christmas broadcast was not his invention either. It had begun with his father in 1932, when the founding director of the BBC, John Reith, talked a skeptical George V into speaking down a microphone at Sandringham to the whole empire at once. The new shortwave service carrying the old king's voice to roughly 20 million people scattered across the snows and deserts and seas of a quarter of the globe. George V had a fine, easy broadcasting voice and took to it. His golden eldest son, Edward, never gave a single Christmas message because his reign did not last a Christmas. And so the tradition, like the coronation date and the souvenirs, passed sideways to the second son, the one man in the family for whom speaking into a microphone was not a pleasant duty but a recurring nightmare. Think about the cruelty of the inheritance. Of all the things a stammerer could be handed, the worst is a job whose central ritual is talking, live, unscripted in feel if not in fact, to millions of people who will hear every catch and every silence. His father had bequeathed him the one duty most precisely designed to expose his deepest weakness, and there was no getting out of it, because by the late 1930s the monarchy lived or died on the radio. A king who could not be heard was a king who could not reign. He made his first Christmas broadcast in 1937, the first year of his reign, a short and careful message thanking the nation and the empire for their support. But the tradition did not truly become his until the war made it necessary, and that is the turn that matters. On Christmas Day 1939, with the country 4 months into a war it dreaded and the future black, he sat at the microphone at Sandringham and did the thing that terrified him, because the people listening in their blacked-out houses needed it more than he needed to be spared. Near the end of the message he read a few lines from an obscure poem by a retired academic named Minnie Louise Haskins, lines about standing at the gate of the year and asking for a light to tread safely into the unknown, and being told instead to go out into the darkness and put one's hand into the hand of God. The poem had been almost entirely unknown. After that broadcast it belonged to the nation. The lines were a favorite of his wife, and the story long told is that it was his 13-year-old daughter, the future Elizabeth II, who found them and pressed them into her father's hands before he spoke. So the words that steadied millions of frightened people in the first winter of the war reached them by way of a daughter passing a poem to her stammering father, who then mastered his breath and read them aloud to the world. Here is where the cold, controlling man and the courageous one stop being two people. Everything the broadcasts asked of him drew on exactly the rigidity that made him so hard to live with. The relentless preparation, the marking up of every text to swap the consonants that tripped him, the rehearsing with Logue until the words were worn smooth, the iron refusal to let the fear reach his voice. All of it was the same controlling discipline that ruled his household and froze his brother out, now turned to a use the whole country could be grateful for. The measured, deliberate, weighted delivery that listeners came to hear as gravity and calm was in part a technique, a controlled pace that let him stay one step ahead of his own throat. The nation heard a king who sounded unhurried and steady. What it was actually hearing was a frightened man clamping down on terror in real time, on air, in front of millions, and refusing to let it win. The control was the courage. There was no daylight between them. The same machinery that made him difficult made him on the radio in the dark years, exactly the voice the country needed. And the broadcasts did something the coronation never could. The coronation was a stage he had inherited and endured. The wireless was a stage he slowly made his own, and through it he built the one thing his cold upbringing had never taught him how to give in person, a sense of nearness. Families sat around their sets on Christmas afternoon and on the grim wartime evenings, and heard the king speak, slowly and with effort, directly into their homes, and the effort itself was the message. They could hear him fighting for the words, they knew what it cost him, and they loved him for the cost in a way they had never quite loved his fluent, charming, absent brother, because a man visibly struggling to do his duty is more moving than a man to whom everything comes easy. The stammer, the thing that had humiliated him his whole life, became, on the radio, the very source of his bond with his people. They were a frightened nation listening to a frightened king refuse to be beaten by his fear, and they took strength from watching him do it. You can draw the line forward from there too. The daughter who handed him the poem grew up to deliver her own Christmas broadcast every year for 70 years, the most consistent fixture of her reign, and she had learned what it was for by watching her father wrestle the microphone into submission every December of her childhood. The control he passed to her was real, and so was this, the understanding that the voice in the home at Christmas was how the monarchy stayed close to people it could never actually meet. He inherited a stage from a brother who walked away. He built a better one out of the medium that frightened him most, and he handed that one down on purpose. If the family was a machine, it had more than one operator, and the second most important after Queen Mary was the woman George married, because the warmth the public saw in Queen Elizabeth was real, and the steel underneath it was just as real. And she spent 66 years using both in the service of the same cold idea of duty. The world remembers her as the Queen Mother, the smiling pastel-clad gin and horses grandmother of the nation, the most beloved royal of her century. That image was a construction, maintained with iron discipline, and it worked precisely because the steel behind it never showed. During the Blitz she became the symbol of British defiance, and the things she did were genuinely brave. When the cabinet urged the royal family to evacuate to Canada for safety, she gave the answer that became famous, that the children would not leave without her, that she would not leave the king, and that the king would never leave. She stayed in London under the bombing. She learned to fire a revolver so that she could defend herself if the Germans came. When a bomb struck Buckingham Palace itself, she said she was almost glad of it, because now she could look the East End in the face. Her effect on morale was so great that Hitler is supposed to have called her the most dangerous woman in Europe, viewing her popularity as a genuine threat. The brilliance of her was that the public courage was not a performance laid over fear. She was frightened by her own private admission, her heart hammering at every raid, and she went out into the bombed streets anyway, in that she was her husband's exact match. Two people doing the terrifying thing while privately terrified, and the country drew strength from both of them without ever seeing the cost. But turn the steel the other way, toward the family, and it stops being inspiring and starts being the cold machine working through a second hand. She never forgave the Windsors. The bitterness over the abdication that had thrust her stammering husband onto a throne she believed shortened his life hardened into a campaign that never cooled across the decades. She blamed Edward and Wallace for everything, and she made sure the frieze her husband had built was maintained long after he was dead, helping to keep the former king and his wife outside the warm circle of the family for the rest of their lives. She was the perfect partner for George precisely because she shared his deepest conviction that the crown came before every private feeling, that the enemies of the family were enemies for life, and that warmth and discipline were the same household virtue wearing two faces. She could charm a crowd and defend her husband's hardest positions with a sweetness that hid the blade. She outlived him by half a century, dying in 2002 at 101, and across all those years the steel never rusted. The machine George inherited from his parents, he also married into, and his wife ran her half of it with a will, every bit as unbending as his own. There was a third kind of operator, neither family nor consort, and to understand how the cold, controlling, never-wrong man actually functioned day to day, you have to meet the courtiers, and above all the one who ran the household, a private secretary named Alan Lascelles, whom everyone called Tommy. Lascelles was born into the courtier class, a grandson of an earl, and he served 4 monarchs across the first half of the century, from George V to the young Elizabeth II. He had served Edward as Prince of Wales in the 1920s and come to despise him, resigning in disgust at the prince's selfishness years before the abdication, telling him to his face that he was unfit. He came back into royal service and became the central figure in the household of George VI, the man who controlled the flow of paper, the access, the advice, the discreet management of everything the king saw and did not see. He kept a diary, published long after his death, and it is one of the most revealing documents we have about how the reign actually worked, because Lascelles saw the king at the closest possible quarters and recorded it in private, with a clear and unsentimental eye. It is from that diary that we get the detail that ties the courtier straight to the cold-tempered man at the center of this story. Lascelles had a private code name for the king's rages, the sudden eruptions the family called the gnashes. He called them Nashville, a small grim joke, because the king gnashed his teeth and raised his clenched fists to the heavens when the fury took him. Think about what that nickname tells you. The man closest to the daily running of the monarchy, the one who managed the king's working life, had needed to coin a private word for his employer's temper, the way you name a recurring storm so you can warn people it is coming. The gnashes were not an occasional family embarrassment. They were a fixture of the household, frequent enough and forceful enough that the most senior courtier in the building had a code for them. Lascelles is also where you see the machinery of control operating below the level of the king himself, because a constitutional monarch who is rarely told he is wrong is partly the creation of the men whose job is to manage rather than to argue. Lascelles was brilliant, conservative, snobbish, and devoted to the institution above any individual who happened to embody it. He had fixed views about who was acceptable and who was not, and his views carried the force of policy. When the household decided someone was beyond the pale, the decision held. It was Lascelles who in 1945 urged the exiled Duke of Windsor to accept his lot and leave his brother in peace, the machinery still working to keep the troublesome former king at bay nearly a decade after the abdication. And it was Lascelles who, after George was dead, told Group Captain Peter Townsend, when the man declared his wish to marry Princess Margaret, that he must be either mad or bad or both. The same rigid line about divorce that had cost Edward the throne and that George had hardened into family law was being enforced years later by the same private secretary on the dead king's own daughter. The machine did not need George alive to keep running. It had men like Lascelles to run it, and they ran it exactly as he would have. This is the quiet truth behind the never wrong man. He did not have to be a tyrant who shouted down every objection, because he was surrounded by a structure designed to prevent the objection ever reaching him. His wife shared his convictions and defended his positions. His mother had built the ethos and enforced it from her own deathbed. His courtiers managed the access and held the lines and named his rages in private code, while presenting an unruffled face in public. Inside that structure, a king does not often hear that he is wrong, not because he forbids it, but because the whole apparatus is arranged so the occasion rarely arises. The control that the title puts on George alone was in truth a thing the entire household carried, each operator turning their own part of the machine, and George at the center of it, the product and the master of a system that had taught 3 generations the same lesson, that the crown came first, and the senior figure was not to be contradicted, because contradiction was a kind of disloyalty to the institution itself. There is a quieter stretch of his life that deserves its place before the end, the post-war years, because they show the control turned to its gentlest use, and because they are where you can watch him, dying without quite knowing it, hand the whole apparatus to the daughter who would carry it for 70 years. The war had been the making of his public self, but victory brought no rest. The country he ruled in 1945 was nearly bankrupt, rationed harder in some ways than during the fighting, grey and tired, and stripped of the empire that had defined his childhood. He worked through it with a Labour government he instinctively distrusted, doing the constitutional thing because duty demanded it. And in the middle of that greyness there were 2 public moments that show what he had become to his people, and they are worth holding up against the cold, controlling man of the title, because they are the same man, the same discipline, turned outward as reassurance rather than inward as severity. In April 1948, he and Elizabeth marked their silver wedding, 25 years since the nervous Duke of York had married the woman who steadied him. They drove from Buckingham Palace to St. Paul's for a service of thanksgiving, through streets lined with people, and the affection was real and earned. A quarter of a century earlier she had turned him down twice out of fear of the cage. They had built inside that cage the one warm thing in his cold inheritance, and the country that had watched them stand in the bombed streets together now turned out to celebrate the marriage that had carried them all through. For a man who had been told his whole life that he was the lesser one, to be cheered through London for the simple fact of a long and steady marriage was its own quiet vindication. Then came his last great public act, and it was the most hopeful thing he ever put his name to. On the 3rd of May 1951, already a dying man though the full truth was being kept even from him, he opened the Festival of Britain from the steps of St. Paul's, before a congregation of 3,000. The festival was meant as a tonic for a battered nation, a deliberate gesture of looking forward after the damage and the austerity, a celebration of British design and science and the future. Over 5 months, some 8.5 million people visited it. There is something almost unbearably fitting in the image. The tired, gaunt, frightened since childhood king, his body failing, standing up to open a festival of the future he would not live to see, gesturing toward a brighter century that would belong not to him but to his daughter. The dutiful man performed one last duty, and it was an act of hope, and it nearly used up what little he had left. 9 months later he was dead, and the crown passed in an instant to a young woman 4,000 miles away, and the manner of it tells you everything about what he had built into her. Elizabeth was in Kenya, the first stop of the Commonwealth tour she was making in her sick father's place. She and Philip had spent the night of the 5th of February at Treetops, a game-watching lodge built up in the branches of a great fig tree in the Aberdare forest, and she had climbed to the lookout at dawn to film elephants and watch the African sunrise. While she was up in that tree, her father's heart stopped in a bedroom in Norfolk. She had gone up to the lookout a princess and would come down, in the course of that day a queen, though the news took hours to reach her. It was Philip who finally told her, walking her out into the garden of their lodge, and up and down the lawn alone. Her private secretary, watching her afterward, remembered her seated at her desk, very composed, absolute master of her fate. Asked what name she wished to reign under, she answered simply, "My own name, of course." Sit with that composure because it is the clearest proof of the inheritance. A 25-year-old has just learned, in a forest on the far side of the world, that her father is dead, and that the whole weight of the crown has dropped onto her in the same instant. And she does not break. She sits at the desk, composed, master of her fate, and begins to do the job. That steadiness was not natural in the sense of effortless. It was learned, drilled into her by watching her father hold himself together under strain for the whole of her childhood. The same clamping down, the same refusal to let the feeling show, the same conviction that the institution came before the private grief. The method George had used to survive his own terror, he had passed to her without ever sitting her down to teach it, simply by being watched, year after year, doing the frightening thing with a steady face. Her grandmother made sure the machine did not pause. Queen Mary, dying of the same cancer that had just killed her son, decreed that the death of the king must not interrupt the succession, that the new young queen must be received and the work must go on. And it did. Mary did not live to see the coronation, dying in March 1953, 10 weeks before it, but she had held the line to the last, exactly as she had taught her son to do, exactly as her son had taught his daughter. The coronation came on the 2nd of June 1953 in the same Westminster Abbey where George had endured his own ordeal 16 years before, with the bishop's thumb over the words of the oath. Elizabeth's was a more confident affair, and it carried one change that would have meant everything to her stammering father, who had fought the very idea of cameras at his own crowning for fear of what they would catch. Hers was the first coronation ever televised. Some 27 million people watched it on screens, 11 million more by radio, 8,000 inside the Abbey. The medium that had terrified George, that had exposed his weakness and that he had spent his life mastering syllable by syllable, was now the thing that carried his daughter's crowning into the homes of the nation he had served. The control he had wrestled the microphone into became for her an ease before the camera he never lived to imagine. And then she reigned. For 70 years, longer than any monarch in the history of the country, and across all of it she ran the machine he had handed her almost exactly as he would have. The reticence that the world came to read as wisdom, the unreadable composure on the balcony, the refusal to explain, to complain, to let the institution look hungry for sympathy. The yearly Christmas broadcast, the fixture she kept up every December for 7 decades, the direct descendant of the broadcasts her father had fought for through his Stammer, the poem she had once handed him now grown into her own lifelong duty. The same control that had made George hard to live with became in his daughter the defining public style of the modern monarchy, admired the world over, and almost nobody watching it ever traced the line back to its source, to a frightened second son in a cold nursery who had learned that the way to survive fear was to clamp down on it and never let it show. That is the truest measure of the cold, controlling, never wrong man. Not the throne he sat on for 15 hard years, but the method he pressed into the woman who sat on it for 70. He took a machine he had inherited from his own cold parents, ran it through the most dangerous reign of the century, and handed it down so completely that the longest and most admired reign in British history was, at its core, his discipline still running, long after his heart had stopped in the night at Sandringham. The control outlived the man. It became the crown itself. And yet here is the thing the machine could never quite explain, the thing that should give you pause if you have ever felt yourself to be small, overlooked, or born into a role too large for you. The system was built to produce a certain kind of man, and it did, and then that man did something the system never asked of him. He became great. Not because the machine made him great, but because somewhere inside all that inherited coldness there was a frightened person who decided every single day to do the hard thing rather than the easy one. The machine gave him the discipline, the greatness he supplied himself. Sit with that, because it is the real lesson of his life and it has nothing to do with crowns. You did not choose the house you were raised in. You did not choose the early verdicts passed on you, the labels stuck to you before you were old enough to argue, the comparison to the brighter sibling or the easier colleague, or the version of yourself everyone seemed to expect. None of that was your doing. But what you do with it, the getting up the next morning, the walking back into the room that humiliated you, the steady refusal to accept the smallness that was handed to you, that part is entirely yours. George was handed every reason to be a footnote. He made himself a king worth weeping for. The raw material was not in his favor. The decision was. Think about how many times in his life the easy exit was right there, fully justified, waiting for him to take it. When he came last in his class, he could have decided he simply was not clever and stopped trying. When his body failed him in the Navy, ulcer and appendix and all, he could have retired quietly into the comfortable invalid life a prince was entitled to. When the Stammer humiliated him at Wembley in front of 100,000 people, he could have asked to be excused from public speaking forever, and no one would have blamed him. When the crown fell on him in 1936, he could have leaned on his own genuine unfitness and let the establishment find someone else, as some of them wanted to. At every one of those forks, the door marked surrender was open, and it had a good and honest reason written above it. He walked past every one. That is the part worth taking into your own life, because your forks look the same. There is always a door marked surrender, and there is almost always a reason above it that other people will accept. You are not qualified. You are not ready. You tried once and it went badly. Someone else would do it better. These are not lies exactly. They are often partly true, the way it was partly true that George was not the man for the throne. But partly true is not the same as final, and the only way anyone has ever discovered the difference is by walking past the easy door and doing the frightening thing anyway. He never once felt ready. He did it all afraid. That is not a flaw in the story. That is the entire story. There is a particular comfort here for anyone who has ever been the second choice, the substitute, the one who got the role because the first pick walked away. Almost nothing in George's life was originally meant for him. The throne was his brother's. The coronation date was his brother's. The very stage of the monarchy had been built around a man who discarded it. He spent his whole reign standing in spaces that had been measured for someone else, wearing a role that had been handed down second-hand, and he could have let that fact define him, could have lived as the understudy who never quite believed he belonged on the stage. Instead, he did the quiet, stubborn work of making the borrowed thing his own, until the day came when no one could imagine anyone else having stood there. The borrowed crown became, in the end, unmistakably his. If you are living in a life that was supposed to be someone else's, the job you took because the plan fell through, the responsibility that landed on you because somebody else left, the role you never auditioned for, then his life is speaking directly to you. It does not matter that the thing was not designed for you. What matters is what you build inside it. The fit was never the point, the work was the point. He proved that a man can be handed a life 2 sizes too large and grow into it by sheer refusal to shrink, and there is no reason on earth you cannot do the same with whatever oversized thing you have been handed. Hold on to the strange gift hidden inside his weakness, because it is the least obvious and maybe the most important thing he has to teach. The stammer was the great humiliation of his life, the wound that made every public moment a possible disaster. And the stammer was also, in the end, the very thing that bound him to his people. When the nation heard him fight for his words on the radio in the dark years of the war, they did not hear a weak king. They heard a man who was struggling exactly as they were struggling, and prevailing exactly as they hoped to prevail, and they loved him for the struggle in a way they never loved the brother to whom everything came easy. The flaw became the bridge. The weakness became the source of the connection. Your weakness may be doing the same work without your knowing it. The thing you are most ashamed of, the limitation you would erase in a heartbeat if you could, may be the very thing that lets other people trust you, recognize themselves in you, draw strength from watching you carry it. Polished, effortless, unbroken people are admired from a distance. It is the ones visibly fighting something who are loved up close. George never chose to be the stammering king. But he discovered, without ever quite meaning to, that a man who is seen to struggle and persist gives other strugglers permission to persist too. That is a kind of power the easy ones never have, and you may have more of it than you think. So take the whole of him with you, the cold and the warm, the controlled and the courageous, because the two were never separable, and that is the final honesty of his story. The same iron that made him hard to live with was the iron that let him stand in a bombed city and not run. The same fear that ruled him was the fear he conquered, in public, syllable by syllable, for 15 years. He was not a simple man, and he did not have a simple life, and the reason he is worth your time is that he refused, against every reasonable excuse, to be defeated by either the world's low estimate of him or his own. He got up, he did the work, he did it afraid. He did it as the second son, the substitute, the stammerer, the one nobody picked, and he did it until it killed him, and along the way he became something none of the people who underestimated him ever imagined he could be. Whatever you have been told you are, whatever verdict was passed on you early and cheaply, remember the frightened boy in the leg braces who could not finish a sentence and grew up to be the steady voice an empire leaned on in its darkest hour. He did not become that by waiting to feel ready, or by fixing himself first, or by being braver than you are. He became it by deciding, one ordinary morning and then the next and then the next, to walk past the easy door and do the frightening thing. That decision was the whole of his greatness, and it is the one thing about him you can copy exactly. So copy it. The world has already underestimated you, the same way it underestimated him. Now go and spend the rest of your life proving it wrong. Before we leave the reign entirely, go back to the one day that was supposed to be his alone, and was, like almost everything in his life, handed down second hand from the brother who had walked away. The coronation took place on the 12th of May 1937, and that date tells you everything. It was the date that had been chosen, printed and promoted for the coronation of Edward VIII. When Edward abdicated, the establishment simply kept the date and changed the king. The souvenirs had already been manufactured with the wrong man's face. Even the supreme ceremony of George's life was a thing inherited from his brother. The program reused, the date reused, the whole apparatus built for someone else and quietly repurposed for the second son who had never expected to stand in it. He had been dreading the day for months, and the morning gave him no mercy. He was woken at 3 in the morning by loudspeakers being tested on Constitution Hill near the palace. A racket he said might as well have been in the royal bedroom. And then the marching bands began and any chance of sleep was gone. The ceremony itself ran nearly 5 hours and suffered from too little rehearsal, and the mishaps came one after another. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, believed the Dean of Westminster had handed him St. Edward's crown the wrong way round, and could not be sure he had set it on the king's head correctly. A bishop trod on the king's robe so that he nearly stumbled. Another bishop put his thumb over the words of the oath at the exact moment the king, the man who fought for every syllable, needed to read them. Picture that. The one man in the kingdom for whom reading aloud was a daily terror, standing at the most scrutinized moment of his life, and a clergyman's thumb covering the words he had to speak. He got through it, the way he got through everything, by clamping down and refusing to let the fear show. And here the title turns its other face, because the coronation is where you see that the same control that made him cold also made him endure. A more relaxed man might have laughed off the thumb and the crown and the trodden robe. George could not laugh them off. The rigidity that ruled his household ruled him too. But that same rigidity was exactly what carried him through 5 hours of ancient ritual, without faltering on the one day the whole empire was listening. The control was not separate from the courage. It was the courage. The frightened, exacting man held himself together by sheer force of the discipline that, behind closed doors, made him so hard to live with. There was one human grace note in the day, and it came from the woman who had built the machine. Queen Mary attended the coronation of her son, breaking a centuries-old protocol that a late king's widow did not appear at the next coronation. She came anyway, to stand by Bertie in his ordeal. And she sat in the gallery with her 2 granddaughters, the 11-year-old Elizabeth and the small Margaret, watching the second son she had raised in that cold nursery become king. The 11-year-old wrote in her own hand about how beautiful her papa looked. The woman who had rationed warmth to her children all their lives bent an ancient rule to be present for one of them on the single day he needed her most, and even that gesture was made in the language the family understood, not an embrace but an appearance, the right presence in the right place, duty performed in public. It was, in its own constrained way, love. It was also, to the last, the machine. That inheritance helped her survive 70 years on the throne. It also made her slow to change the family's rules when those rules began to hurt the people inside them. Her father's control became her restraint, and restraint became the public language of the whole House of Windsor. You can draw a line from a frightened boy in a cold nursery to the unreadable composure of a queen on a balcony, and the line runs straight through George. Margaret inherited the other half of him, the warmth he gave in private and the walls he believed public duty required. A father can make a daughter feel adored and still leave her, after his death, with rules that cut her adult life in two. When she wanted to marry Peter Townsend, a divorced man, it was George's moral line hardened by the abdication that the family reached for, even though George was already in his grave. That is one measure of how completely he ruled. A rule still worked years after the man who set it had stopped breathing. The Duke of Windsor stayed alive across the Channel as the living counter-example, the proof of what private desire had nearly done to the crown. The distance between the brothers never closed, not in the war, not in the long exile, not at the end. George had built part of his own reign around refusing Edward's example, and the family kept refusing it long after both men were gone. If you have stayed with me to the end of this, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel is for. Someone who would rather have the true, tangled human version than the easy lie. So do the things that help. Subscribe if you have not. Like this video so the people who run the numbers show it to more people who are sick of the sanded down version. And tell me in the comments which royal life you want taken apart honestly next, because there are a great many of them and almost everyone has been flattened into a cartoon by people who never bothered to read the accounts of the men and women who were actually in the room. I read every suggestion. I build the next one out of them. Thank you for giving this difficult, dutiful, deeply human king a real hearing. He would not have asked for it. He never asked for anything, which is exactly why he deserves it. And before you go, take one thing from him with you, because his life is worth more than a story you watched once. George VI was the boy nobody picked, bottom of his class, braces on his legs, a voice that would not obey him. A brother who shone so brightly that no one bothered to look at the one standing in the shade. By every measure the world uses to decide who matters, he was the lesser one, and he was told so, in 100 small ways, until he believed it himself. And then he did the only thing that ever truly changes a life. He kept going anyway. He stood on the gun turret while the shells fell. He walked back into the room with the microphone after it had humiliated him in front of 100,000 people. He took a crown he never wanted and carried it through the worst years his country had ever seen, fighting for every word of every broadcast, because the people listening in the dark needed a steady voice more than he needed to be comfortable. He never stopped being afraid. That is the part worth keeping. Courage was never the absence of fear for him. It was the decision, made again every single morning, to do the frightening thing while still afraid of it. You do not have to be fearless to be brave. You do not have to be the favorite, the gifted one, the one everyone expects to win. You only have to refuse to be the one who quits. Whatever it is you have decided you are not good enough for, the job, the voice, the version of yourself you keep putting off, remember that the most underestimated man of his century became, in the end, one of the most admired, not because the fear ever left him, but because he stopped letting it have the last word. The lesser son carried the weight and did not break. So can you. Do the frightening thing. Do it afraid. That is the whole of it, and it is enough. There is something freeing in that. If you let it land, it means you do not have to repair yourself before you begin. You do not have to become brave first and then act. You act first, scared and unsure and convinced you are the wrong person for it, and the bravery is simply the name we give, afterward, to what it looked like from the outside. Nobody watching his wartime broadcasts heard the terror underneath. They heard a king. The terror was real the whole time, and it did not matter, because he did not let it have the last word. What people remember is not what he felt, it is what he did. And hold on to the part about being underestimated, because that may be the most useful thing his whole life has to offer you. He spent decades as the lesser one, the spare, the brother who could not finish a sentence, the one nobody groomed or studied or expected anything from. Every signal the world sent him said he did not matter much. He could have accepted that verdict. Plenty of people do. They are told early what they are worth, and they spend the rest of their lives living down to it. He did not loudly, not with any speech about proving them wrong, but quietly, by simply continuing to turn up and do the work, until the verdict no longer fit. By the end, the man written off as too dull and too damaged to matter was held, by people who had watched him closely, to be one of the most admirable to ever hold the throne. The world's early estimate of him was wrong. The world's early estimate of you may be wrong too. The only way to find out is the way he found out, by outlasting it. His life also says something about the quiet kind of courage, the kind nobody films. We are trained to think of bravery as a single dramatic moment, the charge, the speech, the grand gesture. His was almost never that. His was the courage of the next ordinary morning, the small unwitnessed decision to keep going when quitting would have been easier and forgivable. The cocoa made under fire in the gun turret tells you more about him than any medal could, because it is courage that looks like nothing at all. A man doing the small necessary things steadily while the world explodes around him. Most of the courage your own life will ask of you is that kind. Not the grand stand, the steady continuing, the showing up on the day you most want to disappear. He was a master of exactly that, and it is a mastery available to anyone willing to practice it. So whatever weight has been handed to you, the one you did not ask for and feel sure you cannot carry, look at the boy in the leg braces who became the voice of an empire, and remember that he felt exactly the way you feel now, unready, unqualified. Certain there had been some mistake, that the job belonged to someone stronger. He was right about the fear and wrong about the conclusion. The fear was real and it never fully left him. The conclusion that he could not do it was simply not true, and the only way he ever discovered that was by doing it anyway, afraid one ordinary morning at a time, until the doing had quietly built a man nobody could call lesser again. That is what he leaves you. Not a fairy tale and not a warning, a method proven under the worst pressure a century could supply, for becoming more than the world decided you were. Do the frightening thing. Do it before you feel ready, because ready is not coming. Do it badly at first if you must. Do it on the mornings you can barely stand, and do it afraid, always afraid, because the fear is not the enemy and never was. The enemy is letting the fear choose for you. He never did, and it made a frightened second son into a king his people wept for. What it could make of you nobody yet knows, least of all the people who have already decided. There is only one way to show them, and it is the same way he did. And before you go, take one thing from him with you, because his life is worth more than a story you watched once. George VI was the boy nobody picked, bottom of his class, braces on his legs, a voice that would not obey him, a brother who shone so brightly that no one bothered to look at the one standing in the shade. By every measure the world uses to decide who matters, he was the lesser one, and he was told so, in 100 small ways, until he believed it himself. And then he did the only thing that ever truly changes a life. He kept going anyway. He stood on the gun turret while the shells fell. He walked back into the room with the microphone after it had humiliated him in front of 100,000 people. He took a crown he never wanted and carried it through the worst years his country had ever seen, fighting for every word of every broadcast, because the people listening in the dark needed a steady voice more than he needed to be comfortable. He never stopped being afraid. That is the part worth keeping. Courage was never the absence of fear for him, it was the decision made again every single morning, to do the frightening thing while still afraid of it. You do not have to be fearless to be brave. You do not have to be the favorite, the gifted one, the one everyone expects to win. You only have to refuse to be the one who quits. Whatever it is you have decided you are not good enough for, the job, the voice, the version of yourself you keep putting off. Remember that the most underestimated man of his century became, in the end, one of the most admired, not because the fear ever left him, but because he stopped letting it have the last word. The lesser son carried the weight and did not break. So can you. Do it afraid. That is the whole of it, and it is enough. He did the frightening thing every day until the day he died doing it. Now it is your turn. Go and do yours. One last thing before you close the video. If this hour with George VI gave you something, a fuller picture, a harder truth, maybe a push you needed today, then pass it forward. Hit subscribe so the next honest history finds you instead of the next cartoon. Like this video, because that single tap is what decides whether the people sick of the sanded down version ever get shown the real one. Share it with the one person you know who has been told they are the lesser one, the spare, the not quite enough, because they need this man's story more than they know. And leave me a comment with the name of whoever you want taken apart honestly next. I read every one, and the next script gets built out of them. Thank you for staying to the end. He never asked anyone for anything, so let me ask on his behalf, just this once. Subscribe, and come back for the next one.